Good morning. Please let me know in the comments if you are here for the day, and I will check you off. And then we'll get started. All right, so yesterday you got a little bit of an introduction to the anatomy of the respiratory system through this documentary called Breath of Life. Hopefully the digestive system lab went all right for you, and no one appeared to have any questions. A couple people visited and asked some questions during the meet yesterday, but not many. So I'm hoping that it was fairly clear then from the lab. There are some parts of the lab that are a little bit you got to think about them a little bit anyway. But anyway, apparently it went fine. Just again, let me know. It's really hard for me to figure out in advance like where students are going to get tripped up in a particular activity, especially because that lab is not really one that I've done previously to doing it sort of in hybrid mode. So I haven't done it with students too much. Anyway. And then you watch this little video here about ATP and energy flow in cells. And this is going to be sort of, like I said, it's sort of like the key that holds all the three systems together, this idea of energy flow. And I'm going to make reference to the idea of cells needing oxygen for mitochondria to do oxidative metabolism, that is produce ATP in your cells. And then the waste product is CO2, and then again that plays into the respiratory system, its main function. Okay, so today is day 12. There is a new note package. It's posted right underneath there. It's called, it says day U3 part 2. That's unit 3 part 2, respiratory system, animal structures and function. That's the one that you're going to need. You're going to want to open that in Cami or whatever you're using to edit, or if you've printed it off, you'll need it in front of you. So yesterday, you were introduced to this idea that your cells require oxygen to produce ATP. They mentioned it specifically in the video, the last video. And I believe it mentions in the video that your cells do not actually have very much ATP in them, even when they are fully stocked. Their full stock of ATP, or it's called a buffer, it's like how much you have before you'd run out, is actually pretty small. So when you stop providing your cells with oxygen, you actually run out of ATP in your cells relatively quickly, in a few seconds, 20-ish seconds, and all of a sudden your cells are just no longer functioning properly. Keep in mind that that is not what is happening when you hold your breath. So when you hold your breath, it's more of, there's still air in your lungs, and so you still have oxygen transitioning into your blood and CO2 transitioning out into the volume of air that's already in your lungs. But excuse me. But if you are in an environment where there is no oxygen, so like the vacuum of space, or let's say that you're in an aircraft that's flying fairly high, like normal aircraft fly around 35,000 feet, flight level 35 or 350, I guess it is. There is very little oxygen. And so if you were in an aircraft like that it's essentially going to remove the air from your lungs, or at least remove air from your lungs that has any sizable amount of oxygen in it, because of the low pressure that you experience up at altitude. And so in that case, you aren't perfusing oxygen into your blood, and that's a more realistic simulation of cutting off the flow of oxygen into your circulatory system. And so when you do that, you don't stay conscious for very long. 5 seconds? Not very long. And keep in mind that some cells need more oxygen than others. You're not going to get cell death, for example, in your legs. if you have a few minutes without oxygen, because your legs are, I mean, the cells that you're primarily transporting oxygen to in your legs are muscle cells, right? I mean, there's other stuff too. There's nerve and whatever, but it's primarily muscle that needs oxygen down there. And muscle cells can operate without oxygen or on low oxygen fairly easily. In fact, if you ever have exercised at greater than your maximum capacity to transport oxygen, so that would be called your VO2 max. So if you've exercised at greater than your VO2 max, which you can do in a sprint, or if you're repeatedly lifting a heavy load or something like that, you're exercising those muscles more than the energy can be replenished in them. So if you're doing that, you're exercising over your VO2 max, you have put your muscles in a state where they don't have enough oxygen to use their mitochondria properly and provide enough energy to the cell. And in that case, you get a buildup of lactate, but your cells continue to produce energy. They just produce it without oxygen, anoxically. And that's fine for a little bit. Now, obviously, you can't do that forever. If you do that for more than a minute or two, sometimes less, depending on the load, you're going to get failure, right? The muscle's not going to be able to continue contracting anymore, which if you've ever sprinted, there's a max. You're going to run out of capacity to use your muscles, and it can cause cramping and all kinds of things. So your muscles are going to fail, but they're not necessarily going to die right away. And so experiment that used to be done in kin labs in university, we don't do it anymore because I guess there's some health risks associated with it. But you can cut off the blood supply to somebody's leg with a tourniquet, like a belt. Don't do this at home, by the way. And you can leave it cut off for a long time, hours. And so I've never done this lab, but like it was done basically the year before I was in university. They still did this lab. And I think that the lawyers got involved maybe, and they said, oh, don't do that in case there's any kind of complication or whatever. That's what always happens. But by the way, in this course, we used to do experiments with human blood, if you can believe it. When I was in high school, we used to take blood samples from ourselves and measure them with capillary tubing, look at our number of red blood cells and things like that. I mean, that seems so outrageous now. We used to do human fluid experiments when I was in high school. That is like a huge no-no now. You never ever use human fluids. Even that experiment where you swab your cheek and put a cheek cell down, you're really not supposed to do that. It's technically against the rules. But just because you're never supposed to use any kind of human fluid for the infection risk and whatever. And I don't even mean just because of COVID. I mean like ever, under any circumstances. So, but anyway, things used to be different. so you cut off the blood supply to somebody's leg, and what we did in the lab is we measured the change in metabolites in the blood. We took blood samples from the leg over time to look at how the lactate builds up in the blood, how the amount of oxygen that's dissolved in the blood goes down over time, and stuff like that. Okay, and then when you're done, you just take the tourniquet off, and then you allow blood to flow back into the leg again. And I remember discussing this protocol, and it was a long time. It was like over an hour that you've been cutting off blood supply to this person's leg, and yeah, it's fine. I mean, again, don't do this at home because you can get all kinds of complications, blood clotting and stuff like that, which is why they're not allowed to do it anymore. But I mean, typically there is no harm from doing something like that. So the muscle cells are very resistant to having low oxygen. But there are, on the other end of the spectrum, there are some cells that are tremendously sensitive to low oxygen, and your neurons are a perfect example. So if you cut off blood supply to your head like that, definitely don't do that. But if you cut off blood supply to your head like that, that would 100% be fatal for you. Even if you're cutting off blood supply first of all, you're going to go unconscious in a couple seconds. But beyond that, if you have blood supply cut off for a minute, you're going to start getting permanent damage to the cells in your brain because they use a ton of oxygen and they do not tolerate low oxygen state very well. They just begin dying. So anyway, different cells have sort of a different capacity to deal with low oxygen, and neurons, nerve cells, are very sensitive to low oxygen. So before we get into looking at a little bit of the biochemistry here, we're going to get into the anatomy a little bit deeper. I'm actually going to stop, and I'm going to let you watch this little video. I love this video. I'm a big fan of this YouTube channel. I personally think Destin is such a cool guy. He's an engineer. I think he used to work for NASA, but now he just makes cool science YouTube videos about just interesting phenomena that he comes across. Sometimes he builds cool devices and whatever. It's called Smarter Every Day, and if you've never heard of this YouTube channel before, but basically what this is a video looking at what happens if you don't put the mask on that drops down in an airplane, and why it's important to put your mask on before you help somebody else with their mask. Really, really interesting stuff. And he goes through a little bit of the biology of this. And the most interesting thing to me is he tests it. So he goes to this lab at NASA, or maybe he worked in aerospace. I don't know. I think he worked in aerospace. I don't think he worked at NASA specifically. I might be wrong about that. But basically, he goes in here. I'm going to let you watch it, so I don't want to give everything away. But they give him some tasks to do. First, while he is fully saturated with oxygen, so like at sea level, and then they pump the air out of this chamber and make it very low pressure, similar to being up at a very high flight level in an airplane. And then they get him to do the same tasks. And so you can kind of watch what happens to his neural function, his brain function, as he is not properly transporting oxygen to his brain. Okay, I mean, this is obviously an experiment we could never do in class, but it's really cool to see what happens here. And this completely plays into what we're going to talk about today, the idea of pressure and moving oxygen in and out of your blood, because we're going to talk about how that system works. So I want you to think a little bit about how that's working, how the pressure in the room that you're in is related to moving oxygen into your blood. Okay, so how long is this video? 10 minutes. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'll come back. It's so 8:50, like 8:53. Okay, I'll be back at 8:53, and we're going to just quickly chat about this video, and then we're going to get started with the note. All right. Hey, welcome back. Yes, Brandon, that is exactly who I'm confusing Destin here with. I'm confusing with Mark Rober. Mark Rober, he worked for NASA. He used to work, I think. And Destin has some other job. He's an engineer, but I think he works in the aerospace industry too. But I'm not 100% sure anymore. But anyway, yes, I'm definitely confusing those two. Cool, right? I love the look on his face when they're like, put your mask on. Okay. Yep. You're going to die now. You're going to die now if you don't put your mask on. He's just kind of like, he's got nothing. So that makes me laugh. It really very quickly does impair your brain function. And keep in mind, as he mentioned here, they didn't even take him up to the same height that you would be at if you were flying a commercial jet, right? Which would be like 35,000 feet. Like, he wasn't that high. And if you were that high, I mean, it would have been a much quicker drop off in neurological function. So anyway, I just think that's fascinating. After we go through the anatomy, so what we're going to do now, we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of oxygen transport, how the oxygen gets in, how the CO2 gets out. It's just diffusion, which hopefully you're familiar with from chemistry, but we'll do a quick little review of what diffusion is. But once we've gone through all that anatomy, the last component here is I have a little video that is a bronchoscopy. It's essentially somebody having a procedure done where they put a video camera, it's a fiber optic camera, on a tube up through their nasal cavity, down their pharynx, and then down through the trachea, past the larynx, or larynx first, larynx, trachea, and then you can see the bronchi and the bronchioles and stuff like that. And then they take some samples and stuff. A little bit graphic because they're going to take some tissue samples from this guy's bronchi, which, yeah, maybe there's a little bit of blood involved there. It's not like super gory or anything, but it does a great job of actually showing you the anatomy. This is something that, like, I would love to show you in class. Like, hey, let's look inside somebody's larynx and, like, see their vocal cords operating. I mean, I can't do that, but I can show you a video of somebody else doing it. So this particular video, you can fast forward around. You don't have to, like, watch it from beginning to end. It's quite long, and they talk about, like, the anesthetic and, like, all this other stuff. That's not really relevant for this course, so you don't need to worry about that. But at least the part where they're putting the camera in and following the path of the upper and lower airway, so you can actually, like, see what the structures of the airway look like. I think that's really valuable. They also get him to kind of, like, talk and go and stuff while they're looking at his vocal cords, so you can see them vibrating. So if you've ever been curious to see what your vocal cords actually look like and how they vibrate in order for you to produce sound, again, fascinating. So I'll leave that for you to watch afterwards. But it's a fascinating video, something I wouldn't normally be able to show you in class, so highly recommend it. Okay, cellular respiration. You may remember from the diversity unit that most organisms do some form of cellular respiration, and most of them require oxygen. Now, that's not to say all. We did talk about some anaerobes, some obligate and some facultative anaerobes that are bacteria that don't need oxygen for their metabolism. There's also chemoautotrophs that use weird chemical compounds found at the bottom of the ocean to do their metabolism. But for the most part, pretty much all organisms are using oxidative metabolism. They're using oxygen to produce ATP. It's mostly ATP in most organisms. So, and the ATP was discussed a little bit in that video that you watched yesterday. So, we are one of those, obviously. We use oxidative respiration, or cellular respiration. Plants have mitochondria, animals have mitochondria, most protists have mitochondria, all fungi have mitochondria. So at least all of the eukaryotes are using this aerobic cellular respiration. Aerobic just means with oxygen. So in order for us to get that oxygen to our cells, we have to pump it. We got to send it in. It's actually not so much of a pumping. We're not pumping it in, but we are refreshing the oxygen or the air that is sitting around our alveoli. And we'll get into the anatomy of that in a second. But in order to do that refreshing, you need to take somewhere between 17,000 and 29,000 breaths a day. And this is going to be dependent on whether you're physically active, your lung capacity, your body size, your health. Because if you have a respiratory illness, it may be significantly more than that number of breaths because you'd be actually transitioning less air per breath. But anyway, that's a rough estimate. Wow, that's a lot. 17,000 to 29,000 breaths a day. You don't really think about that, but you're doing it all the time. So that means that over your lifetime, you're taking between 500,000 and 750 million breaths. It's kind of an important process when you really think about it. It's sustaining your life. You're doing it all the time. And if you stop breathing, which, I mean, you can do at will, stop. You can physically force yourself to stop. However, it does automatically resume. So you can't shortcut this one. If you do manage to hold your breath long enough for you to go unconscious, which is physically possible, don't do that. But if you do that, the first thing that your body will do once you become unconscious is resume breathing. So your body really does want you to keep breathing. There are some mechanisms in place that prevent you from circumventing that process intentionally. Obviously, it's so important. It can't be conscious. It's autonomic. So movement of your that muscle is the diaphragm. Movement of your diaphragm, which is the muscle that creates negative pressure in your lungs for breathing, and we'll talk about the mechanism, how that works later, is one of those few muscles in your body that have both a conscious control and an autonomic control, which is basically like an automatic brainstem version of control. And you can take over control of that autonomic system at will. It's a really fascinating process when you think about it, because the moment you stop thinking about breathing, there is just a system that takes over and makes sure that you keep breathing. You're not going to forget, unless you have certain neurological problems. Those actually do exist that prevent you from continuing to breathe when you switch back over to your autonomic system. It's I think they're actually neurological diseases in the brainstem, which is where a lot of the automatic control of your body systems occurs. So anyway, that does exist. It's a little bit scary, but for the most part, if you stop thinking about it, you're going to keep breathing, which is really fascinating. There's really not a lot of systems in your body that you can easily consciously control, and then just forget about them at will and then have them keep functioning. In fact, I don't think I can think of a single other example of that. Your heart is entirely autonomically controlled. You can affect your heart rate, but not directly the way you can with your lungs. Blinking. That's a good example, Derek. Okay. Yep. I would say that is primarily falling under autonomic control. And okay, there you go. Wow. It pays to have 33 other people thinking about the same problem. But yeah, blinking. There's another good example. I'm not sure if I can think of any others. I didn't think of that one either. Yeah, there's not a lot. Anyway, it's a fascinating system. You may recall this formula. Hopefully you talked about it in grade 10, at least momentarily. But this is the chemical equation for oxidative metabolism. Oxygen plus primarily sugar is going to react to produce carbon dioxide, water, and it's going to release energy. That is cellular respiration. That's the formula for cellular respiration. And you'll notice that it is the exact opposite as the formula for photosynthesis. So if you wanted to make this the formula for photosynthesis, pretty easy. All you have to do is, oops, that's not what I meant to do. All you have to do is just reverse the arrow. That's photosynthesis. So I think that's really cool, which is that these two are perfectly harmonious processes. That's not the word I'm looking for. Reciprocal. They're reciprocal processes, where one is basically just the process of the other one in reverse. And so we have that relationship with plants in that we do this formula one way, and plants do the formula the other way. And that's what allows us to maintain our existence on Earth and maintain the concentration of gases in the atmosphere, because we need plants to be replenishing the store of oxygen. And to a great extent, plants require animals, not necessarily humans, but require animals to replenish their storage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which they need to do photosynthesis. So it is reciprocal. Anyway, and so when you look at the ingredients here, the main one that we're going to be focusing on today is obviously the oxygen component, because the respiratory system needs that. So we're going to be focusing on how we get oxygen in to the system. To some extent, we're also going to be talking about the output over here and a little bit about this, because that is the product of this process, and we got to get rid of that. We got to remove the carbon dioxide from the system. Now you might be looking at this and saying, okay, well, we must be missing something here. And actually, maybe you don't see that. But first of all, one thing that you probably have noticed is that we typically write this as being glucose being the substrate here, the thing that is being oxidized in order to produce energy. That's obviously a little bit of an exaggeration to suggest that it's always glucose. It is typically glucose. That is the primary energy molecule in the body, but you are aware from our discussions of macromolecules and macronutrients that this molecule can also be a fat. So the important thing here is that it is a carbon compound that has a number of carbons that are linked together with hydrogens and sometimes hydroxide, so oxygen and hydrogen bound to the end of them. Okay, so the body's fairly flexible, and by body I mean cells. Cells are fairly flexible, and that they don't require just one particular molecule in order to do this respiration. So sugar is the primary molecule, but keep in mind that glucose is only even one type of sugar. So there's glucose and fructose and others, okay, and they can all be utilized in this pathway. This also brings to mind something interesting, which is the idea of what is in 0-cal Coke or something like that. Because you might be thinking, well, it tastes sweet. It in fact does have a sugar in it. So it is a molecule that is sugar-like. It has the same basic structure as sugar. And so when it lands on the tongue, it tastes like sugar. It actually activates the same receptors on the tongue that regular sugar activates. But because of a slightly different arrangement of oxygens and hydrogens on the sugar, it actually can't be broken down by the enzymes that are used for oxidative metabolism. So we can't bust apart that fake sugar molecule because of the placement of a couple oxygens and hydrogens on it. It doesn't fit in the enzymes properly. And because of that, your body just largely ignores them. They actually stay dissolved in your blood, and they are eventually just filtered out by your kidneys. So that's how the diet Coke works, in that it's giving you a sugar, but it's just not the sugar that you can process oxidatively in your cells, and so it doesn't end up getting utilized. Now, that's a really interesting question, Cam. That is one potential pathway. Now, I don't believe that the glucose receptors that you have in your blood actually bind to most of the sugar alternatives that exist on the market. I do not think that they do. Those receptors are not the only things that activate the release of insulin, but I know this I'm going to have to look up, but I'm fairly confident that they don't bind to glucose receptors that cause the release of insulin. I'm going to have to double check that. That's a fascinating possibility. If that were true, diet drinks would be deadly to people with diabetes, because they would cause insulin spiking, even though your actual true blood sugar was low, which would cause your blood sugar to go so low that it would probably cause brain damage. I don't think that is true. So I'm gonna have to double check that one. That seems unlikely to me. Anybody diabetic in here that's comfortable saying whether or not they are negatively affected by drinking diet drinks? I believe it's a safe alternative for diabetics, which would mean that is not a true statement. Anyway, I'll look it up. I'm going to store that one away and look that up, because that's a really fascinating idea. Now, there are other issues with diet drinks. One of them is that they mess with hunger signaling. When you drink a diet drink, part of the hormone cascade in your brain that says, I've had something to eat, is related to the sweetness of the thing that you're eating. That satiation mechanism, satiety or satiation, is the feeling of being fulfilled by the food that you've consumed. I'm full, in other words. So part of that comes from, I know we're way off track here, but part of that comes from the sugar that you're eating, tasting sweet, or whatever it is in your food. It's sugars usually, and fats also activate that satiety mechanism. Those hormones are released. However, with sugary drinks, they don't actually increase your blood sugar. So it causes a disconnect in your brain between feeling full based on the sugar, sweetness, taste, and feeling full based on the increase in blood sugar. And those two things are normally linked together. And when you change that balance between the two of them, you stop feeling satiated by eating sweet things. So there is some evidence to show that a lot of diet drink consumption means that you are less sensitive when you actually eat sugar, meaning that you tend to consume more actual sugar when you do consume actual sugar. It doesn't satiate you as much as it used to. And there are obviously dietary implications of that potentially. So that is one potential pitfall to replacing your sugars with fake sugars. However, consuming a high amount of sugar in your diet is extremely detrimental for your health and for many different reasons. And so, I mean, for a lot of people, the diet drink is an alternative that is not going to raise your blood sugar dramatically, which was 100% going to at least put you on a path towards poor vascular health, diabetes potentially, and other things, consuming a diet high in sugar. Sammy, that is my feeling on this as well, is that I don't think that it interacts with the glucose receptors in the blood. I'm almost 100% positive. I will double check that though. That's going to take me a few minutes to look up, so I won't do it right now, but during the break, I'll look it up. Anyway, what we actually take into our lungs is obviously not pure oxygen. I'm sure you're aware of that. We don't live in a 100% oxygen environment. If we did, actually it'd be insane if we did, because if you lit something like a fire, I mean, every fire would be an explosion. If you lit a campfire, I mean, it would vaporize the wood in the campfire in seconds. It would be an explosion. Every time any fire existed, it would vaporize the oxidative material instantly. Everything would be an explosion. So we don't live in a completely oxygen environment. There'd be lots of negative potential consequences to being in a 100% oxygen environment, but it's actually primarily nitrogen that you're breathing, and you probably already know that. And nitrogen, if you can remember way back to grade 9, let me try and connect this to something in grade 9 for you. If you'll remember, there is nitrogen in the atmosphere that is unavailable. It's bio-unavailable. Organisms cannot use the nitrogen in the environment because, and again, I got to take you back to your grade 10 chemistry. Nitrogen is triple bonded to another nitrogen like this. This is N2 gas, nitrogen gas, and that is a very stable, very strong bond. So it's basically bio-unavailable. The only organisms that can free up that nitrogen and turn it into a different compound and use it are certain soil bacteria. And they're called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. You would have probably talked about this during the nitrogen cycle in grade 9. So that's one of the only organisms that can actually use nitrogen gas. Other than that, you can imagine that this molecule is completely inert. You mostly breathe in nitrogen and you mostly exhale nitrogen, and it has no impact on your biochemistry at all. It goes in and it goes out completely unaltered. So the nitrogen component is basically nothing. It is not involved in our metabolism. Sorry, I just noticed some questions here. Are there any planets with 100% oxygen in our solar system? No. No, not in our solar system. And it would be very difficult to maintain a 100% oxygen environment because oxygen is very reactive. It loves to grab electrons from neighbors. And so it would be rapidly combining with other materials if it was in extremely high quantities in the atmosphere. I cannot think of a single, well, there's none in our solar system. I mean, outside the solar system, who knows? There's crazy, I mean, I'm sure there is, because the universe is massive, possibly infinite. So it definitely exists somewhere, but not in our solar system. Would be really cool if there was. Since the oxygen concentration was higher in the past, living things were much bigger. Does that mean if the oxygen concentration increased now, we would get bigger? As humans? No, not necessarily. I mean, not instantly, anyway. What you're saying is absolutely true, by the way, Kim. If you go back to like the Jurassic or the Cretaceous period, and you look primarily at insects, it's a key that we're discussing insects specifically, because insects breathe through their skin. They don't have lungs the way that many other animals do, and so they are limited in size almost entirely by the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere. If there was more oxygen in the atmosphere, it would mean that more oxygen would be able to be passively pushed across their carapace, across their body, into their circulation. And so it could support a larger organism if there was a higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere. And that is in fact what did happen in the distant past. We're talking about tens of millions of years ago. And so we got things like dragonflies that were the size of, I don't know, at least a couple meters. So that's a big dragonfly. I mean, it's not technically a dragonfly. It's the ancestors of modern dragonflies, but they were very large. And that's an evolved characteristic. They evolved to be larger because it provided them with a selective advantage. Now, could insects evolve in the future if the concentration of oxygen went up in the atmosphere to be large again? Absolutely. They could do that. It would take time. It would take a long time for them to evolve that way. But they could evolve to become larger. The question for larger organisms like us is a little bit of a different question, because we don't have the same restriction in terms of size. And I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. Look at a blue whale or an elephant. Those are species that have lungs. And yes, they are larger. they certainly can be larger because lungs are so effective at getting that oxygen out of the air. And yes, animals can evolve to, certainly mammals can evolve to be extremely large. And I don't think that the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere is what's limiting there. So, I mean, we could evolve to become larger over time, but it wouldn't be because of that. But for insects, it's definitely a limiting factor. And that is proven historically. So you're absolutely right, Kim. That's fascinating. Anyway, you noticed in the video, we can't survive very long if we stop getting this stuff, because we stop doing this process, and yeah, our cells stop functioning, mostly neurons. So I want to talk a little bit about here the importance of this ATP molecule. So what have I done over here? There it is, by the way. There's the molecule. You would have talked about phosphate in grade 10 as being a polyatomic ion. There it is down there at the bottom, PO4 3 minus. And phosphate is, I've mentioned this previously, extremely important in a biochemical context. It's used in all kinds of processes in the body. And adenosine triphosphate, you may notice, this is ATP, by the way, adenosine triphosphate. This is the energy molecule that virtually everything in your cell uses. So when we're talking about muscle cells contracting and, we're talking about this protein being built, we're talking about ribosomes building things. Anytime we talk about stuff being built or done inside the cell, that takes energy. You need energy to do things. We're talking about an enzyme coming along and making an RNA molecule, or we're talking about something being moved from one end of the cell to the other. You have to do that. Like, that stuff has to be done. And anytime you do work, you actually do something, it takes energy to do that. And so what's happening in the background of all these different processes that we're talking about is that ATP, this molecule, is being used to do that process. There's usually a binding site on the protein that is being used, and a ATP, which is an adenosine, which is adenine, which is kind of cool. Adenine, you'll remember, is one of the nitrogenous bases in DNA. These things get reused all the time. There's a ribose sugar that's attached, which is part of RNA, right? It's one of the components of RNA. A lot of stuff gets recycled here. So we have an adenine, a ribose, and then 3 phosphates are attached to the ribose on the bottom. You don't need to memorize the structure of this. This is more something for grade 12 biology that you actually need to know the structure. But I'm pointing it out because you're probably familiar with phosphate from grade 10. And what is happening is it's getting cycled. So every time you build an ATP in the mitochondria, you are going to add this phosphate in. So it had 2 phosphates, but you add a phosphate on, and that's like an energy storage bond. That bond between those 2 phosphates contains energy. And whenever an ATP, now it's an ATP, it is adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3 phosphates, whenever it gets stuck to something that uses it, it's actually going to pop this last phosphate off. And as it pops that phosphate off, that is actually going to release the energy that is contained in the adenosine triphosphate. And then it becomes adenosine diphosphate, di for 2. Okay, so it keeps cycling between adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate. And every time you stick this phosphate on, it is holding energy. It's like an energy holding molecule. And every time you use energy, you're going to grab an ATP and you're going to pop this phosphate off, and then it will release its energy into the process that you want to do. Okay, so ATP is one of the most important molecules inside any cell. It is the energy holding molecule that is being produced inside your mitochondria. So this is important because when we go back to this formula at the top of respiration, that is the energy part. I mean, it's very nebulous to say energy, like, ooh, energy. Like, what does that mean? Is there just like a little fire or something inside? No. The energy is in the form of this chemical bond in ATP. That's what we're talking about when we say energy. Yes, you can measure it in joules, you can measure it in energy units because we know how much energy is contained within that bond. But it's not like this nebulous thing where it's like, energy. Like, what does that mean? It's a very specific thing. We are building ATP. That's what the energy is. Okay? All right, so I just wanted to point that out because so we fully understand what's going on with this formula. So within your cells, what you're doing is you are constantly replenishing this storage of ATP up here in your cells. Okay? Remember that is the molecule that is holding all of the energy. Sorry, excuse my diagram here. This is a horrifically poor diagram. But in my head, this is how I think of ATP, and I believe that thinking about this is going to be very useful for you as well. Okay? Because what I think of inside of my cells, what's going on inside of my cells, is a water wheel. Okay? A water wheel converts water energy, like the energy of flowing water, into work, right? A water wheel turns, maybe it turns a grindstone, or maybe it turns a flywheel that is used to power a factory in the early industrial age. Okay? A lot of factories ran on water wheels. So just imagine that, okay? That's what's going on in your cell. So you can imagine that the water wheel is all the different cellular processes of your cells, okay? You got to build RNA. You got to use RNA to build proteins. You got to operate all the functions of the Golgi apparatus. You got to operate all the functions of the ER, which is folding proteins and transporting proteins. You've got to build new strands of DNA during interphase. You got to, all these things. All these things require energy. So those are the water wheels, okay? And the water at the top tank here, this is the energy-filled water at the top, is your ATP storage. That is your energy molecule, okay? And as that energy molecule goes through the water wheel and drops off its energy, it ends up in a lower storage tank down here that is basically the same molecule but minus the energy. And that's the ADP, adenosine diphosphate. It's lost that phosphate where it was holding the energy. Okay, so your cells are constantly using up their ATP, and it's becoming ADP, and that is what's powering the water wheel of all of your different cellular functions. For some reason in my head, this is a very good, this makes it all make sense for me. I don't know, hopefully this is a good analogy for you as well, but this certainly works for me. And so you need a way to get this ADP back up into the top tank again, right? You got to refill your energy storage. And so you need to do the process of cellular respiration. Cell respiration is a pump that pumps the ADP back up into the top tank and makes it ATP again. Okay? Everybody with me kind of on this? So, and then where the size of your pump, this is a great metaphor for talking about capacity here, because how much ATP you actually keep in your cells, the actual volumes of these tanks, is your buffer. That's how much ATP you actually have inside of your cell and how much ADP you have inside of your cell. That's the buffer, okay? And it's very small. These tanks are tiny in your cells, which is why you constantly have to be pumping with this pump. And as soon as your pump stops, immediately, within a couple seconds, the tank on the top is going to run out. Okay, and then all of your water wheels stop turning, and then depending on the cell, it may start dying, or it's just going to start producing lactate and stuff. But if it's a neuron, it's going to start dying very quickly. So, what you can measure the strength of the tank, okay, or not the strength of the tank, the strength of the pump. All right, that is how quickly you can take stuff from the bottom tank and put it into the top tank. And we have a measurement for this, okay? It is the volume of oxygen that you can process per second, okay? That is basically measuring the strength of this pump. How quickly can you move stuff from the bottom tank into the top tank? And the maximum rate that you can move it is called your VO2 max. That is your volume of oxygen that you can utilize maximum. Okay, the maximum amount of oxygen. And remember that going back to our formula up here, the amount of oxygen that you can use is what is determining how quickly you can produce this energy. It's all based on how quickly you can use oxygen. All right, so when we're talking about VO2 max, we're talking about how quickly you can fill the top tank in your cells. The other part of this, which could be, I mean, you can imagine what the other roadblocks would be in order to determine how quickly you can pump, right? How quickly you can fill that ATP up. Well, this one is not going to be the limiting factor, how much sugar you have, because typically you can just eat more sugar. And there is lots of sugar stored in your muscle cells and in all your cells. There's some sugar that's mobilized in your blood, which you can pump into your cells. You can also utilize fat here. And so in general, this is not going to be what limits the pump. Okay? The only time where this part of the formula limits the pump is if you are doing an endurance sport and you are, let's say that you're running and you don't drink any sugar or anything, and you run for 4 hours, okay, or something like that at a fairly quick rate. You're running a marathon, all right? In that case, it is possible for this particular part of the formula to limit your VO2. In other words, you run out of fuel. That's called hitting the wall. And so that is physically possible. You can run out of fuel. I mean, it's unlikely for the average person. Okay, probably many of you have never ran a marathon before. It's likely. Maybe you have. In which case, it's possible that you have approached or have hit the wall before. But just keep in mind that in general, this is not what's limiting your ability to process oxygen. Okay, so it's never discussed as part of your VO2 because this is considered to be essentially infinite. If you're drinking sugar, you're going to maintain this. But this part is limiting. Okay, how fast you can get the oxygen through your cells and into this process. All right. So we measure VO2, this amount of oxygen that you can transport. And by the way, there's lots of things that contribute to that. It's not limited by your lungs usually, unless you have some type of illness. So it's not limited at the lungs, but it is limited in terms of how quickly your heart can pump blood, like the volume of blood that your heart can pump, because remember that oxygen is transported in the blood. How much oxygen your blood can hold, which is limited by the number of red blood cells. We're going to talk about this, when we talk about the circulatory system a little bit more. It's limited by the actual rate in which you can pull oxygen out of your blood, which has to do with how many capillaries, tiny blood vessels you have around your muscles and things like that. So there are different factors that play into how quickly you can actually get this oxygen into you, but it's not usually limited at the lungs. So if we look at some values for this, for a typical individual, okay, and you'll notice this is measured in milliliters per kilogram of body mass per minute, okay? So this is the amount of oxygen in milliliters. You can measure oxygen in mils per kilogram of body mass per minute, okay, of time. As a sedentary person, which unfortunately probably many of us are, okay, not getting a ton of physical activity, and I am talking about somebody of approximately the age of, mid-teens to early 20s, okay? So I'm trying to apply this to you. Your VO2 max is probably somewhere around 35 milliliters per kilogram per minute if you are a regular sedentary person. Okay, that is an average. As you get older, the average goes down in the population quite a bit actually, which is really unfortunate. People tend to become less fit as they age. That doesn't have to happen, by the way. That's totally dependent on you, but it tends to happen. And it's actually a little bit higher for babies. So you actually start off with a fairly high VO2 max. Part of that is because their body weight, their body mass is actually so low, so it actually is going to affect the calculation of this a little bit. But regular sedentary person has about 35 mils per kilogram per minute. If you start to drift below 20, once you get into that area, that's usually a result of some type of illness. You are having difficulty breathing enough. Maybe you have a obstructive respiratory illness, or asthma, or which is an obstructive pulmonary illness, or you have some other illness that is preventing your circulation from functioning properly, or heart disease, or something that is preventing you from pumping oxygen to your cells. So that's going to be an illness state once you start drifting below 20 mils per kilogram per minute. Is that common in the population? Certainly for older people it is. So it's not like it's unheard of for you to be in that range, but at your age it would be very unlikely. If your VO2 max is below 20 mils per kilogram per minute, you are going to be extremely winded from climbing a flight of stairs. And I'd like to believe that there's nobody in this room that is in that in that boat, but there may be. But anyway, 35 mils per kilogram per minute is common for a sedentary person. Somewhere around 45 to 50, maybe 55, is normal for a normally active individual. So 55 mils per kilogram per minute would be somebody who occasionally exercises. Maybe you follow Health Canada's guidelines for exercise, which is pathetically low. It's like half an hour of intense exercise per day, which, you know what? A lot of us probably don't get that, which is a little bit sad. But those are the guidelines for maintaining health. Your VO2 is probably somewhere around 55 mils per kilogram per minute. So that's probably an average for a normally active person. And if you're up at the elite level, you're training hard as a cyclist or as a marathon runner, you're probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 mils per kilogram per minute. So there's a whole range, obviously, of being able to transport oxygen, where an elite athlete's going to be somewhere up right near the top. For example, if you look at a lot of the top cyclists, like Tour de France cyclists, a lot of their VO2 maxes are 85, 86 mils per kilogram per minute, 81 mils per kilogram per minute, somewhere in that range. So that's really, really high at the elite level, where even in the 70s, anywhere in the 70s is considered to be excellent VO2 max. Great question, Kim. Or sorry, Anna. Sorry, I'm mixing up names over here. I shouldn't do that. I can see them right in front of me. There are a couple ways. You can do the question, by the way, was how do you determine your VO2? And by that, I mean, I'm assuming you mean VO2 max. VO2 is just how much, this volume of oxygen you are currently using. So right now your VO2, I'm assuming you're not exercising, is going to be your VO2 at rest, how much oxygen you're using at rest. Your max is the absolute highest amount of oxygen that you can utilize in your cells. So you can do predictive tests. In fact, maybe I'll post a predictive test on Brightspace in case you're interested in doing a predictive test. There are several of them that you can do by just going for a run, basically, and timing yourself and looking at your heart rate and stuff like that. You can get a approximation of your VO2 max. They're not. There's quite a bit of error involved in measuring them predictively, but there's some tests that are fairly good. The best way to do it is to actually do a real measurement of the oxygen that you're using, which you can absolutely do. And let me show you what that looks like. There's somebody wearing the device right there. So this individual has got a device, and what that device does is it knows how much oxygen is going in, and it's measuring the amount of oxygen in the gas that is coming back out again. And so by comparing those two values, knowing how much air is going in and the percentage oxygen, and then how much air is coming out and the percentage oxygen, it can measure the difference, and then so it can determine how much is actually being utilized. Then you're going to do some exercise, and as you're exercising progressively, it's looking at the change in the amount of oxygen that you're utilizing. Okay, and then it's actually going to measure at failure. It's going to keep increasing your work rate until you are no longer consuming additional oxygen. And there's basically a plateau. There's going to be a maximum amount that you can take out of the air that you're breathing, and once you hit that, that's your VO2 max. So this gentleman is doing one of these tests. The new devices are awesome. They're wireless and have the sensors built right into them. They're extremely expensive, but now they have wireless ones, so you don't have to have this big hose coming out. I find this thing so uncomfortable. I've had to do a number of these as part of my undergrad. We did a bunch of VO2 measurements, and they're very uncomfortable to have in your mouth. There's like a mouthpiece that like goes in your mouth while you're running, and it's very uncomfortable. This is a newer one. This looks much more comfortable than what I had. There was no head strap holding the mask on for the one that I used. You had to like hold it in your teeth, which is very uncomfortable. This looks a lot better, but they actually have wireless units now, so you don't have to have a big hose attached while you're running as fast as you can, which makes it a little bit easier. But this is the actual way that you measure it. And by the way, in order to do this, you also need to know the person's body mass, and so you need to weigh the person as well, because remember, it's per kilogram of body mass. Hopefully I answered your question, Anastasia, but you can measure that. My wandering watch uses heart rate and pace during a run. Is that going to be accurate? It's fairly accurate. It's fairly accurate. I'm sure if you looked into the specific model of watch, they probably tell you what the error bar is on that. Like it'll be plus or minus 5 mils per kilogram per minute or whatever. There's definitely a margin for error in those measurements because they're predictive testing. They're not actually measuring the gas concentrations. That being said, Brendan, there are the new Apple Watch is coming out in the fall, I believe, and I've heard little whisperings that there is actually going to be a blood gas monitor built into the new Apple Watch that can measure the concentration of gases in your blood. And there is potential there for a very accurate VO2 measurement. So I'd be fascinated to see how that's potentially incorporated into the new Apple Watch, whether or not it can very accurately measure things like VO2 max. That would be really cool if that was true. Because there's new technology coming out for measuring blood gas concentration, like at the skin. It's brand new stuff. But currently, those predictive equations, they're a little bit problematic. Do they work? Absolutely. They're going to give you a pretty good estimate, and certainly for training purposes. Really, instead of knowing absolute values, what you really want is comparative values. Like, are you improving? Basically, is what you want to know. in terms of having a precise absolute value, that's going to require testing like this. There's really no way around it. But certainly, the predictive results will give you good markers for training. Anyway, so we're getting a little bit off track here, but these are great questions. Anyway, so this is all about getting gas into your blood and getting the gas, oxygen, into your cells. Okay? Are there really? Garmin already uses that technology. Okay, now I'm going to investigate this. That's cool. I would be fascinated if that is already being deployed. And I would like to also know the margin for error on the measurements in those devices. Maybe that technology is far ahead of what I'm aware of, but that's really cool. And I'm going to investigate that too. How do you get the gas in? Well, you don't pump it. The main way that you get the oxygen from your lungs that you're breathing in, the main way you get it into your blood is just simply by diffusion. Diffusion is such an important process in biochemistry. It is pretty much the main way that you transport stuff around. And all that diffusion is the idea that gases and liquids, fluids, I should say, this applies to gas and liquid, things always move from high concentration to low concentration, just based on the physical forces at work. That is a universal principle, is that things move from high concentration to low concentration. And an example of this, the one that I always like to give to students, is the idea that if you were to go in the corner of a room, okay, and this is exactly the same thing. If you were to go into the corner of a room and you were to spray some perfume particles, okay, so you spray some perfume particles into the room, what happens is that there's going to be a really high concentration of perfume particles over in this side of the room. But over time, because of diffusion, naturally, these particles are going to want to space themselves out into the room. And so you're going to get movement of the particles slowly. Oh, am I going to be able to move these? I'm going to try. You're going to get movement of the particles drifting out. Oh, didn't like that. What's going on? Why is my screen going crazy? Nope, don't do that. Drifting out into the room, and they're going to spread out. And eventually, you're going to get an even distribution of these particles throughout the room. That's diffusion. The particles are, and that kind of makes sense in your head. You wouldn't think that those perfume particles are just going to stay in a little ball in the corner of the room, right? It just intrinsically makes sense that, sure, they're not going to just all huddle together. What molecules wouldn't do that? They're just going to start spreading out from each other into the room. And that is, in fact, what they do. They do that naturally. And so I want to show you a little physics demonstration here. I think this will sort of clear this idea up for you. And this is involved in so many of these processes. I know I talked about this in the digestion note as well. The idea that you have all these nutrients in your small intestine. Why do they go into your blood vessels in your small intestine? Why do they actually go into the, what's the name of those? Villi. Why do they actually transport into the villi? Diffusion. You have a high concentration in your small intestine, a low concentration in the blood, and naturally those nutrients are going to diffuse in to the villi. That's how they go in. They don't get pumped in. It doesn't take energy to do it. They naturally go in. So I want to show you a little demo here. Here it is. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a bunch of particles on this side of my room, okay? If I remove this so there's a green barrier in the middle of this room, okay? Basically a wall. And these particles are just bouncing off each other. They have a little bit of energy. This is just like regular gases, okay? Just particles bouncing into each other, bouncing around. What do you think will happen to the particles if I remove the barrier? What do you think? I feel like you probably intrinsically know this. I'll give people a second there, like midway typing. So that feels right in your gut, right? Right, Anastasia? Right, Jaleel? Serena? They're going to spread out. They're going to go through the entire room. And so if I remove the divider, you're gonna see exactly that happening. And when you look at the number of particles afterwards on either side of the room, you'll notice that they've equalized. There's now the same number of particles on both sides of the room. And this is sort of like if you have gas on one side of the room and a barrier, and there's a vacuum on the other side. You also intrinsically know that if you remove that barrier, it's not going to maintain the vacuum, the empty space on the other side. The particles are going to get sucked over, basically, until they equalize in the room. And that's what's just happened here. Okay? Now, I'm going to show you another situation that is not as obvious as this. Okay? So instead of showing you just an empty side of the room, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the same number of particles on the other side of the room. Okay? And now I'm going to remove the barrier. It's the same number of particles on both sides. What do you think will happen in terms of the distribution of the particles if I remove the barrier? And I'm actually going to put is it a scale? No, that's not what I want. I want a center of mass. So the center of mass is showing basically where the center is of all of the particles. How are they distributed in the room? And so you can see that their centers of mass are roughly in the center of each of their respective boxes because the particles are distributed in their box. What do you think will happen if I remove the barrier now? This is a little bit different than what's happened before because there's no vacuum on the other side. Give people a second. Think about it if they want to add something. These are great guesses, by the way. These are great guesses. So what you've said, Michaela, this idea that both particles are going to equalize makes sense. Now, the other thing that you mentioned, would they potentially stay where they are, is a possibility. That they will stay separated within the room. I mean, that could happen. So what I'm asking basically is which one of those options is more likely? Callum, you got an interesting guess as well here. This idea of you're going to be mixing and get a homogeneous mixture on both sides. Now you're right, Lillian, that this is a slightly different situation in that because the room is not empty, it does change the rate of change. You're right that how long it takes for them to equalize is different. However, I'm gonna remove the barrier so we can see what happens here. And also take a look at the center of mass for each of these because that's going to dictate sort of where the middle is of all of the particles. And by the way, keep in mind there's no magic computer cheating going on here. This is a physics simulation. All they've done is given the particles basically motion and direction and allowed them to impact with each other. So this isn't cheating. This is what happens in an actual sample. So purely based on random collisions. I find this so cool. You will notice that the center of mass for both of these is roughly now distributed in the center of each container. Okay, and if you let this run for long enough, it actually equalizes even more so. In which case the centers of mass like really closely line up with the center of the container over time. And this is just due to random collisions. Okay, this is a physical property of matter. So this is what I'm talking about here. This is diffusion. Particles don't want to maintain, they just purely based on their physics, don't want to maintain an area of high concentration. In fact, they never do in nature. So going back to before, what's going on here? Going back to my example here before of the spreading out of the perfume particles. There are other particles in the room as well. Okay, so you have to imagine there are other particles in the room that are kind of getting bumped out of the way. But they're going to interact with those particles. It's not like they're moving into a vacuum, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that there's other particles in the room. Those particles are going to want to even out. And so because of this, if you have a high concentration of oxygen somewhere, it's going to want to naturally diffuse over to where there is a low concentration of oxygen. Okay, and you've set up a perfect example of that. I'm going to let you write down what's over there in a second, but I want to show you what's actually happening here within the cell. And I'm so sorry about my color scheme here. I did a terrible job with colors. Hopefully that's visible. Okay, what I have written here is that in the alveoli, and you guys looked at the anatomy here yesterday in the video, but I'm going to go over it again. In the alveoli, which are the little tiny sacs inside your lungs, you have a high O2 concentration. When you put things in square brackets, by the way, in chemistry, you probably talked about this in chemistry, things in square brackets like CO2 in brackets, that means concentration, okay? That's the concentration of. So you have high concentration of O2 in your alveoli. And because of diffusion, that means, and you have low O2 in your blood that's coming back through the lungs, right? That's that's the blood that has already been through all the tissues in your body. The oxygen has been used up, and now it's returning back to the lungs again. So you've got low O2 in the blood, and you've got very high O2 in your alveoli. And so naturally then, you're going to get this drift of O2, this diffusion of O2 into the blood. That is the exact same thing as what I just showed you in the example of the two gases on either side. We have a higher proportion of O2 in the alveoli and a lower proportion in the blood, and so you're going to get movement of oxygen into the blood. That's diffusion. This works as long as you keep the concentration of O2 in your alveoli, that's inside of your lungs, high. And you do that by continuing to breathe. As long as you breathe, you're going to keep topping up the amount of O2 that's in your alveoli, and that will keep that concentration gradient. It's called a gradient because it's very high on one end and low on the other. That's a gradient. It's keeping the concentration gradient in existence. There's a gradient, a difference in the amount from one side to the other. And as long as you maintain that gradient, you are going to continuously push oxygen, for lack of a better word, it's just diffusion that's pushing it, but push oxygen into your blood. As soon as you stop breathing, the concentration of O2 in your alveoli is going to start going down. Because remember, it's leaving into your blood, and so it's going to go down and down and down and down. And eventually, if you hold your breath for long enough, there won't be enough concentration of oxygen in your lungs to keep pumping oxygen through diffusion into your blood. In which case, you're going to stop perfusing your cells with blood, with oxygen, because you're just not adding new oxygen to your blood any longer. And so you're suffocating at that point is what's happening. Okay? And that's why you got to keep breathing. When you're exercising, you are pumping more blood through your alveoli. So in order to diffuse enough oxygen into your blood, you need to increase how fast you breathe so that you replenish that oxygen in your lungs at a faster rate. Okay? In other words, you're providing more oxygen to be diffused into your blood. Okay? It's just increasing the rate of diffusion when you're exercising, because you're basically sending blood faster through these capillaries, these tiny blood vessels in your lungs. Your heart is pumping faster, all that stuff. You're pumping blood quicker. Now, on the other side of this, we can't forget about the products of cellular respiration, because this is not just about getting oxygen in. It's also about removing the product of respiration, which is carbon dioxide. So if you can imagine that coming in through this blood is going to be lots and lots of CO2. So you have high CO2 in your blood. Now, in the air that you're breathing in, there is relatively low CO2. So if you've got low CO2 in the alveoli because you're breathing, and you've got high CO2 in your blood, there is another diffusion gradient that exists here, but with CO2. And so that CO2 now is going to diffuse out of your blood. So you have two simultaneous diffusions that are happening here. You've got oxygen diffusing into your blood, and you've got CO2 diffusing out of your blood at the same time. Oh, no idea who that is. Let's get that later. And that is how you are getting the gases either into your blood, oxygen in, and CO2 out. So that's just what I have written here. There's a high concentration of O2 in your alveoli, and if you keep breathing, that's if you keep breathing, and a low concentration of O2 in your blood returning from your cells, and that means that O2 will always diffuse into your blood, and then it's just the opposite for CO2. I'll give you a second to write this down. And also, while you're writing that down, if you have any questions about this process, something is not clear, please say something. It's kind of an important concept in biology. I took a little bit of extra time with that because this is something that students often get hung up on. If you're wondering why Destin, in the video we watched at the beginning of the day, difficulty getting oxygen, you have to think back to what is actually happening in the alveoli. So if you look at the alveoli again here, what you've changed is the concentration of oxygen here. Oh, that's not really showing up. You've changed the concentration of oxygen here. In other words, it's no longer a very high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli because you're thinning the air out. Disconnected. Sorry, guys. I got disconnected. I think. Am I back live again? Sorry, I just got a message saying I was disconnected. Okay, cool. And Brendan, I read your comment. That's cool. I'm definitely going to look into that. My wife trains for triathlons, and I think that she would be fascinated by that device. I have to investigate that. Okay, so let's keep going here. I also just wanted to mention very quickly that at the cellular level, so when you actually get to your cells, remember you're going to transport this blood to your cells, which are going to use the oxygen, that the exact opposite thing is happening at your cells, which is that you're going to have high CO2 in your cells, because remember, that's where it's being made by your mitochondria, and therefore it's going to get passed into your blood, which has low CO2 in it. Okay, so there's another diffusion gradient. And your cells have low O2 in them because they're using up their O2. And you've got high O2 in the blood because you just put it in the blood at the lungs. And so it's going to go from the blood into any particular cell. And so at the other end of the line, after you transport the blood, you're going to get the opposite exchange happening. CO2 is going to be going into the blood at the cell, and O2 is going to be going into the cell from the blood. That you probably already knew that, but I just wanted to point that out. It's the opposite process is happening at whatever cell. And these little tiny blood vessels that are feeding your cells, they're called capillaries, which we'll get into more detail when we talk about the circulatory system. Every single cell in your body is no more than 3 cells away from a capillary. So those tiny little blood cells, tiny little blood vessels rather, are running all over your body, through everything, through all of your tissues, in order to properly provide oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. One other tiny little thing that I want to mention is that, well, I showed you that example of diffusion. You know, you have a barrier in the middle, and then you've got stuff exchanging if you remove the barrier. Well, the alveoli here and the blood vessels are not no barrier. It's not like you've completely removed barrier. The barrier is still there, right? There's still cells that are in between. But what we've created here is pretty much the thinnest barrier that we can possibly make without a leak happening. We can't have leaks. We can't have it be open, or the blood would just come out into the alveoli. But we've kept it as thin as we can possibly make it. The alveoli are only 1 cell thick, and it's a little teeny tiny little cell that is very perforated and allows a lot of gas exchange across it. And the same thing is true for the capillary on the other side. It allows a lot of gas exchange to occur across that single cell capillary. And so this is pretty fragile, this arrangement of blood vessels, which is why your lungs are pretty fragile. I mean, they have a very small barrier going in between the blood vessels and the air. And we'll kind of get into this when we talk about illnesses of the respiratory system, but obviously if you damage your alveoli, you're going to get leaks. You're going to get water leaking or blood leaking into your lungs for various reasons, and we'll talk about those. But your alveoli are quite fragile because they're only 1 cell thick to allow that diffusion to occur. Okay, let's talk about some structures of your respiratory system. How much time do I have here? 20 minutes? How far do I want to get here? I want to get to, I don't know if we'll get this far. I want to get to this before we're not going to. We'll have to do it when we come back. But let's at least get through the structures. In a respiratory system in mammals, and we're mostly going to focus on mammalian systems for this unit. Again, just to keep it relevant for you, we could go way off the beaten track and talk about insect respiration and stuff like that. We're not going to do that. Mostly due to time. So in mammals, of which we are mammals, there is a sort of a four component minimum that is necessary in order for this whole system to work. And we've already kind of discussed these features a little bit. So first of all, you need a thin membrane for gas exchange. Okay? And that is anytime that you want gas to pass from one side of a membrane to the other, which we want for diffusion, you got to make it really thin. So I've just mentioned that, the idea that the alveolar tissue is 1 cell thick and the capillary tissue is 1 cell thick. So you're going to need a thin membrane in order to do gas exchange. Now this is not specific to mammals. All animal respiratory systems are going to require a very thin membrane for gas transportation. And I'll give you an example of a comparison. If you look in the gills of a fish, in their gills, they only have a 1 cell barrier between the water and their blood. That's what's going on inside of the gills. It's a very, very thin membrane that is allowing oxygen to transport from the water into their blood. So you need a thin membrane. In order to get enough gas into your body to actually maintain the concentration of oxygen that's necessary, think about, you're made of 100 trillion cells. So many cells you got to provide oxygen to. So in order to make this work, you need a very large surface area for gas exchange. So how many alveoli do you have? Hundreds of thousands. A lot. And it's also important not only to have lots of alveoli, but to make them in a shape that has the most surface area as you can possibly get for the amount of volume. And so maybe you know this from math class already, from geometry, but spheres have the highest surface area on the outside compared to the amount of volume inside them. Okay, they have the highest surface area to volume ratio, which is exactly why the alveoli are spherical. They evolved to be spheres because spheres have a high surface area to volume ratio, which maximizes the amount of gas transport. So they're spheres. You also need to provide lots of blood. So the lungs have an absolutely massive blood supply in order to allow this much gas transport to occur. Okay, so you need high blood supply and many, many, many tiny capillaries are running around through your lungs. And if you this diagram really shows it well, which is that there is a network of capillaries going around each alveoli. They are very, very highly vascularized, which if you can imagine, if you're doing surgery on somebody's lungs, man, do you ever have to be careful? Because when you cut them, they bleed like crazy. There is so much blood supply to the lungs, and so they're very difficult. You don't want to nick them when you're doing surgery. And when you do, if you ever have to remove parts of the lungs, like if you have a tumor or something in your lungs, it is extremely difficult to do effectively because you're cutting through miles of blood vessels as you go through there, and there's just blood coming out everywhere. So it is, remember that half of your heart, actually I shouldn't say remember, we haven't covered this yet, but half of your heart is devoted just to pumping blood to the lungs. Half of your heart. So it's pretty important. And then lastly, you need to ventilate. Ventilate is just simply bringing air into the lungs and removing old air out of the lungs. That's ventilation. And so you have to have some kind of system for ventilation. In mammals, we have a muscular system for ventilation. Many ocean organisms simply passively do this by swimming. So as they swim, water is just passing over their gills. But fish actually also actively fan water over top of the gills. You may have seen fish do the little bloop, bloop, bloop when they like move their gills around. Probably doesn't make a sound, but that is fanning water over top of their gills, which is increasing the amount of ventilation, basically, across their gills. They're just ventilating with water instead of air. Okay, so those are the four main things that are required for a mammalian system to function properly. And we basically talked about where you find all of those things in the mammalian system. So I want to very quickly talk about some key structures. Okay, so we're going to follow the system down from the mouth all the way down to the fine structures here and talk about some structural features of each of these. Remember that in this unit and in a lot of these units, but especially when we're talking about plants and animals, we're going to talk about the anatomy, that's the structure, and then we're going to talk about some of the functional aspects of that anatomy. In other words, what do the structures do? And you may have noticed that trend in digestive system already. We talked about what the structures are and the structural features and how those features are connected with their function, what they do. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing here a little bit with the respiratory system. First of all, at the very top, you've got an oral passage, or a mouth, and a nasal passage. Okay, you don't typically breathe through your oral passage, although you might do it if you're trying to pull a lot of air in. But typically, you breathe through your nose, through your nasal passage. Okay, especially at rest. And your nasal passage has some interesting structures inside that are very helpful. And those structural features are the fact that you have mucous membranes in there and little hairs. And you can probably guess what the purpose of these is. The mucous membranes have a dual purpose in that they moisturize the air that's coming in. You have to keep your alveoli pretty wet in order for them to function properly. If you dry the cells out in your alveoli, remember it's only one cell thick, that's a very fragile cell that's inside your alveoli, and so you kind of have to keep them nice and wet. If you can imagine drying out the skin on your hands, if you've ever had really dry skin on your hands, they like crack and stuff like that when they get dry. Well, if you can imagine, if you do that to your alveoli, you're going to cause some damage in there. They have to be moist pretty much all the time. And that also allows gases to diffuse through the water. So the water that is sitting on the surface of your alveoli is actually allowing the gases to diffuse. So when you dry them out, you get greatly reduced diffusion. So the mucous membranes moisturize the air that's coming in, and they also are filters. So the mucous membranes have this sticky mucus on them, snot, and it catches particles from the air that you're breathing in, junk, stuff that you don't want to bring into your respiratory system. Same thing for the hairs. The hairs catch the big stuff. They prevent, like if you've ever worked with wood, hopefully you wear a mask if you're doing any kind of grinding or sawdust or anything like that. It's really not a good idea to breathe in a lot of lignin, which is what's in wood particles. It's very unhealthy for your lungs. Wear a mask. But a lot of that stuff is filtered out by your nose hairs. And the mucus. Okay, so you're going to filter some large particles with that. Then the air is going to pass through the pharynx. Okay, so that's the pharynx right here is the back of your throat. Sometimes it's called the oropharynx. Okay, oropharynx is basically just the back of your throat. Oro meaning that it's from the oral cavity to the throat. So it's sort of like this transition area of back of mouth to back of throat. That's oropharynx. And then it's going to go down through the pharynx and past a little tiny structure right here called the epiglottis. So the epiglottis, and we talked about this, I believe, with the digestive system as well, is a little tiny flap. And in general, the flap is open. Okay? Assuming that you're just sitting there breathing right now, your flap, your epiglottis, is open. When you swallow, part of that swallowing motion, and you can actually feel it if you put your hand, if you rest it on your larynx and swallow, you may notice that the larynx shifts up a little bit as you swallow. So what's actually happening is this larynx is moving up, which is causing the flap to fall down. And when the flap falls down, it covers up your trachea. That's so you don't swallow food into your breathing tube, into your trachea, which would be a big problem. So that little system exists. I think I mentioned it down here. So I've got the epiglottis, which is a tracheal cover activated by swallowing. Pretty important for our survival to cover up the trachea every time we swallow food. Otherwise, half of it would go into our through the larynx and into the trachea. So it prevents food from entering the larynx. The larynx is where your vocal cords are located. Males generally have a slightly larger protrusion on their larynx, but females, you have this too. So sometimes it's referred to as an Adam's apple. Everybody has this. All humans have it. So you can feel it right here on the front. It's a little bump. So that's your larynx. So inside the larynx, there is sort of a little flap on each side. You'll see it in the video when you get a chance to see the video of the laryngoscopy. And those little flaps sort of form like a V, and they are cords of tissue on either side that when you blow air across them, you can tighten up the cords and make them really tight, or you can relax the cords. And based on how tight you string the cords with your muscles, you can change the tone of the sound that comes out, which is what you use to sing and talk and change the tone of your voice by increasing the tension or decreasing the tension. It's sort of like if you've ever tuned a guitar, when you tighten up the string, it goes to a higher note, and when you relax the string, when you loosen the string, it goes to a lower note. It's exactly the same thing happening in your vocal cords. You have a string that you are passing air across to make it vibrate at a specific frequency. If you're into physics, we can talk more about that process. But anyway, after that, you've got your trachea. So the trachea is a pipe, and it has some really cool structural features on it that you can feel if you kind of lay your head back and run your finger up and down on your trachea. You can feel the ridges. So those ridges are made out of cartilage. So they are cartilaginous rings, and those rings are there to hold open the trachea. You also, on your trachea, have little tiny hairs. So the cells that are found on the lining of your trachea, that would be these cells right here, they grow these tiny little hairs on them called cilia. And the type of cells, those types of cells are called ciliated epithelium. And the hairs can actually grab tiny particles and push them up along the cilia, up your trachea, and then past the larynx so that you can swallow them. Okay, so they catch particles basically and remove them from your respiratory tract. And so small particles, they have to be larger than 3 microns, I think, in general, but smaller than, I don't know what the limit would be on the large side, but if the particles are very large, you have to cough them up. And if you've ever accidentally swallowed something into your trachea, they had something go down the wrong pipe, you know what I'm talking about here. If it's a large particle, you got to cough it up. But if it's a smaller particle, these ciliated epithelium are going to be slowly moving them back up to the top of your trachea so that you can remove them. Okay, so that's the bottom part here, which is that ciliated epithelium grabs and removes particles. So cool. You have like a little cleaning system inside. I love it. This cleaning system, by the way, your ciliated epithelium, is paralyzed by cigarette smoke. Usually for several hours after they're exposed to cigarette smoke. So not only are you filling your lungs with a bunch of junk when you do smoke, if you do smoke, which you shouldn't, you're also paralyzing the system that your body has to remove junk from the system, which is one of the reasons why smokers are far, far more likely to get respiratory infections than non-smokers, because you just get more junk in there and you have difficulty removing it. If you're smoking all the time, you've basically removed this as a system that is keeping your lung tissue healthy. Bummer. Don't smoke. It's terrible for you. It's extremely difficult to quit, as I've heard from many of my friends, by the way. They're really struggling to quit smoking. I also wanted to mention that along with the ciliated epithelium, there's also mucous membranes there as well that form a sticky mucus, and the mucus catches particles. So it's sort of like a flypaper almost, if you've ever seen flypaper before. Now, if you wanted to see a closer view of a ciliated epithelium, I'd love to show it to you under the electron microscope. Can I find a micrograph? Oh, look. Google has everything. Yeah, of course. So this is not an electron micrograph. This is just with a light microscope, but there you go. You can actually see the little hairs right on there. So those are the little cilia on the ciliated epithelium, and they are able to move particles up out of your respiratory system. Somebody asked a question. Is that what would cause the smoker's cough? That's part of it. That's part of it. The long-term damage that's caused by smoking is more related to scarring of your alveoli, which we're going to talk about in more detail when we talk about illnesses of the respiratory system. That's in the second half today. So that is more associated with smoker's cough than the paralyzing the ciliated epithelium, but they are related to each other. Unfortunately for smokers, there's a whole cascade of failures that occur when you smoke long term. This is one of them. So this is absolutely a contributing factor to the smoker's cough. Every time I talk to my dad on the phone, who is a lifetime smoker, it's actually kind of sad. I mean, it is very sad to hear him cough. He's not a healthy man. So I know from personal experience, well, not my experience, I guess, but family experience that it's very detrimental long term to your health. Don't smoke, guys. I like you all. I don't want you to have to deal with the consequences of that. I'm almost done here, guys, by the way. Okay. Once we've gone down through the trachea, it separates into two bronchi. Okay, we're going to go left and right here on the bronchi. And then it's going to subdivide into smaller little passageways, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And those tiny passageways are called bronchioles. Okay, so it goes from bronchi. Bronchi are the two big ones at the top, the split, and then it goes into tiny bronchioles. Okay, so the bronchi and the bronchioles, they also have ciliated epithelium on them. Okay, so that system goes pretty much all the way to the bottom, and mucous membranes. And remember that those mucous membranes and ciliated epithelium are for grabbing and removing particles. So they also have that. Now, once you get all the way down into the alveoli, okay, so now we're talking about the end of the line here, the tiny little sacs that are at the end of the line, okay? At that point, there is no ciliated epithelium all the way at the very bottom. So once you get particles right down there to the very end, they are quite difficult to remove. They're not impossible to remove, but the alveoli are not ciliated. Remember, they have to be extremely thin for gas transport, and so they can't actually support ciliated epithelium on them. So only the tiniest particles, ppm 3 or less, so 3 microns or less, is what's making it down there. Only the smallest particles. And so obviously, you get those particles when you smoke. Don't smoke. They're going to get particles into your alveoli that you have a lot of difficulty removing. Now, I should say that there are several kinds of air pollution that are ppm 3 and lower, 3 micron pollution and lower, or 2.5 micron, I think, is actually the limit for that. And that's considered to be the most dangerous air pollution, again, because it goes all the way down to your alveoli, and it's very difficult to remove, causes scarring, and it eventually causes emphysema. So we don't have a ton of ppm 2.5 and smaller pollution in North America. We do a fairly good job regulating it, but there's lots of places in the world where there's a tremendous amount of ppm 2.5 and smaller. And I don't know why I'm saying ppm. That would be parts per million. I mean PM 2.5, particulate matter of 2.5 microns and smaller. Not ppm, PM. Anyway, so then we get right down to the alveoli level, where there is no ciliated epithelium, but they have a structural feature in that they are one cell thick, they are spherical, which remember has a high surface area to volume ratio, and they have a ton of blood supply for good gas exchange. They are highly vascularized. Vascularized just means that there is a lot of blood supply to that tissue. Okay, and why is that? Maximum gas exchange. I realize that I've gone a tiny bit over time here. My apologies. I just wanted to finish this sheet so it weren't cut off right in the middle. When we come back from the break, we are going to talk about gas exchange. In other words, how do you actually force air into the system and get air out of your system? That breathing mechanism. And then we're going to talk a little bit about illnesses of the respiratory system. And then that's it. And so we're going to be doing that stuff in the second half. And I'm going to stop talking now because I've cut into your break, and I apologize for that. Okay. Have a good one, and I will talk to you shortly. Okay. So let's get back to what we were talking about here. We were discussing a little bit about how we actually get oxygen into the system. That would be the ventilation component. We talked about how we transfer it from the lungs into the circulatory system, and that would be the diffusion component across the alveolar membrane and the capillary. And then we talked a little bit about the anatomy here, and how the anatomy is structurally formed to promote its function. Okay, and we talked about a little bit of the functional components of some of the anatomy, which is probably not something that you discussed in grade 10. Although I think the basic anatomy, probably the layout of the respiratory system, you did discuss. Okay, what we're going to do now is spend a little bit of time talking about how we actually breathe. And once we're done that, let me just double check that I haven't missed anything. So once we do that, at your leisure, whenever you want, there is a video here. It says that it's age restricted, which is so silly. Age restricted due to laryngoscopy. I don't know why that would be age restricted. A child can't see what the inside of their larynx looks like. Why? scary, or I don't know. Nothing bad happens in this video that a child couldn't see. I'd show it to my son. He's 5. But anyway, I guess some people are offended by a laryngoscopy procedure, which makes no sense. But I'm sure you can, if you're logged in to YouTube, you'll be able to watch it. But anyway, it's laryngoscopy. Watch it at your leisure. I guess you don't technically have to watch it. And I would definitely fast forward around to find the spot where they actually go in through the nasal cavity, past the oropharynx, down through the larynx, trachea. You can actually see the bronchi from the inside. Anyway, if you're interested, you can see what the actual anatomy looks like. It helps for memory as well to kind of follow it down, but I'll leave it up to you. And then the second part here, once we're done talking about the dynamics of breathing, how you actually do it, how you breathe, like get the air in and out, or ventilating, I guess I should say. We're going to go through a little presentation here on illnesses of the respiratory system, some ways in which the anatomy can fail of the respiratory system. And some of these you'll already have heard of, like we're going to talk about asthma very briefly, and some of them you maybe have never heard of before. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's just a list of several common ailments of the respiratory system, and it plays into the anatomy component, and it also is potentially something that you might want to discuss in your project, right? Because you're going to be looking at a diagnostic or treatment technology, and it could be for one of these illnesses if you prefer. So you're welcome to use one of them. We're actually going to talk about illnesses of the respiratory and the circulatory system. I can't remember if I did this for the digestive system or not on the previous one. I don't think I did. So I have one of these for a digestive system too, but I skipped it because we're a little bit short on time now. So, but anyway, we're going to do that. And if you're interested, this is just purely for interest at the end. I added a Chubby Emu video. I love these. They are, Chubby Emu is a YouTube channel where they do medical case studies. So they're mostly done at the layperson level. So everything is explained as if to explain it to basically to a high school student. So you have the requisite knowledge to understand 99% of the stuff in the video. Like it's not at the level of speaking to a medical professional. So it's definitely accessible for you. Although there are a couple things in there that might be cruising over your head a little bit. And maybe this is more directed at sort of like a first-year bio student in university, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close to the right level. But anyway, his YouTube channel is full of this stuff, and basically he follows a medical case study. This happened to a person. They presented to the emergency room with these symptoms. How did the doctors in this situation figure out what happened to this person and treat what happened to this person? And it's really fascinating. I watched them in grade 8. Perfect. Like, I mean, I don't think there's any barrier from a grade 8 student being able to understand the majority of the stuff in these videos. I think they're fantastic. Anyway, I watch them with my wife all the time. My wife is a physician. And I think that we both enjoy trying to figure out, sometimes they don't tell you what's wrong with the person. And we both enjoy trying to make a prediction based on the testing. Hopefully my wife does a better job than I do, but we try and figure out what's wrong with the person based on presentation at emergency, which is kind of fun to do. Anyway, this one is about somebody who ate 3 laundry pods. Obviously not recommended, and if you watch the video you'll know why. But I mean, there's always talk about what people do on TikTok or stuff like that for the views. This is a person who has eaten some laundry pods, or at least put them in their mouth for the views, and then a look at what actually happened to them, which is not good. So the reason I'm posting it here is because it's all about the respiratory system. So this person aspirates accidentally some of these laundry pods, which is pretty much unavoidable if you put them in your mouth. Do not put them in your mouth. And then it talks about what effect that had on the person's respiratory system. It very much includes a lot of the anatomy and the structural functional stuff that we talked about today, but in a practical way. So like, here's like a use of understanding the anatomy and function of the respiratory system, which is diagnosis and treatment of an illness. I mean, this would be sort of like the highest level of utilization of this information. So anyway, if you're interested, this is completely for your interest. If you, I like to put little things that are sort of, I don't know what you'd call them, enhancement. There's a name for this. enrichment. It's like an enrichment activity. Okay, so if you're interested in this, is like sort of taking it to the next level application, and plus it's just fun. It's just interesting video. So if you're interested, they're extremely well made, and by a actually I don't know what the doctor is that makes these videos. Is he an ER physician? He certainly talks about ER experience a lot. I think he's an ER physician, but I'm not 100% sure actually. He's a physician. And then the last little piece that I put in here, we're going to talk a little bit about asbestosis today, which is what happens when you get small particles of asbestos into your alveoli. And you may be wondering, like, while we're talking about that, like, why the heck did we use asbestos for anything? It seems like utterly ridiculous considering how dangerous it is. It's extremely dangerous. We only had the asbestos removed from the school 3 years ago. So the school was jam-packed with asbestos insulation as recent as 3 years ago. Now, it was sequestered away up in the ceiling, so unless you went up in there, you weren't going to expose yourself to asbestos. But, I mean, it's still not a great idea to have that hanging out all over a school. So I believe KCI and what's the one in Cambridge? The really old school in Cambridge. The one that looks like a castle. Galt Collegiate? Those are the last schools to have their asbestos removed. We're the oldest schools in the board, and so we had the most asbestos, unfortunately. But now the asbestos is actually removed from the school. So anyway, why did we use it? Well, because of things like this. This is actually an advertisement for asbestos from 1942, and it talks about the magical uses of asbestos and why everybody should put asbestos in their house and make everything out of asbestos, because it's so cool, guys. I love this thing. So as you're watching this, imagine somebody in 1942 just frolicking in the asbestos. Once you see how dangerous it is, I think you'll be absolutely blown away by that. If you've ever seen The Wizard of Oz, if you've ever seen the scene, I believe is it snow that's in The Wizard of Oz that's like falling from the ceiling? The snow that is in that scene, I'll see if I can find it on YouTube afterwards, is actually asbestos. They used to use it as fake snow in movies all the time. They just showered the people on the movie set with asbestos. It's really hard to believe when you realize how dangerous it is. Anyway, let's get going here. I won't waste any more time talking about that. So I want you to think about something. What do you need to do to breathe in? Okay, so kind of relax where you're seated, and breathe in. Okay, and as you're doing that, I mean, you don't do this very often, but think about what is actually going on inside your body when you breathe in. So the first thing that you probably notice is that from about the bottom of your ribs up, nothing is happening. In other words, you don't really utilize anything in your lungs to breathe in. In fact, your lungs have no muscle in them at all and are completely uninvolved in the ventilation process. They are not initiating or doing any of the ventilation. So you may have noticed that there is like an expansion that is occurring in your abdominal cavity. There's a little bit of an expansion, a little bit of pressure forming in your abdominal cavity. And that is because there is a little muscle that is attached all around the bottom of your rib cage. Okay, so you can imagine this is three-dimensionally at the bottom here. And that's your diaphragm. And when you're inhaling, what you're actually doing is contracting that muscle, which is pulling down on the bottom of your lungs. Now, it's not attached to the bottom of your lungs, but there is an empty space in between the bottom of your lungs and your diaphragm. And so when you pull down on the diaphragm, you are creating a vacuum underneath the lungs. And obviously, nature abhors a vacuum. Nature hates a vacuum. And so the lungs are going to follow along because they're going to get pulled along into the vacuum that is being formed underneath them. Okay? So that's actually going to drag the lungs down and outwards into that cavity. Okay, it's going to pull the bottom of the lungs down. And when you do that, what you're going to form inside of the lungs is an area with low pressure. Okay, because you're basically pulling outwards on the lungs, which is going to create negative pressure on the inside of the lungs. Okay, you're pulling outwards on that space. All right, everybody with me so far? So that's a low pressure area inside of your lungs. You haven't changed the pressure on the outside of your mouth, like in the world. The pressure on the outside of the world is the same. So now, that pressure on the outside of the world, comparatively, compared to the inside of your lungs, is actually high pressure. There's more pressure on the outside of your body than on the inside of your body. And if you'll remember the principle of diffusion, which we just talked about, remember diffusion from this morning, gases and liquids always move from high pressure to low pressure. So if you create a gradient, a difference in pressure from two locations, things are always going to move from the high pressure area to the low pressure area. That's the principle of diffusion. And that's how how pumps operate and all kinds of things in nature operate this way, but pumps work this way as well. So we've created a negative pressure or a low pressure inside, and then there's a relative high pressure outside. And so then you get flow. So flow is going to force the air into your lungs. And you'll notice that you've done that without really using your lungs for anything. Your lungs have no muscle in them. They're not pulling the air in themselves. All of the work is being done by your diaphragm, by that muscle that's sitting underneath your rib cage. Okay, so just to summarize here, I've just summarized that exact thing here. You contract your diaphragm. That creates a low pressure area inside your lungs relative to the outside air. And then air always moves, or any gas moves from high pressure to low pressure. So air is going to go into the lungs. That's inhalation. And you'll notice that I mentioned that you have to contract. Woo! Let me just throw my Apple Pencil across the room. I mentioned that you have to contract your lungs. Not your lungs. Contract your diaphragm. And contraction is an active process. It's something you have to do. So because you have to do it, it uses energy. You are going to actually consume ATP, and you have to burn sugar in order to breathe in. So inhalation is what's called an active process. An active process means you have to actually expend energy to do it. It's also true that your lungs are primarily made of connective tissue, and that connective tissue is very elastic. It's not that dissimilar from a balloon. So when you've inhaled and filled up the balloon, and then you relax, so I'd like you to do the same thing. Breathe in, and then once you've taken in a large breath, I want you to think about what you have to do to actually get the air out of your lungs when you're done. Okay, try it right now. Breathe in a bunch of air. And then what do you have to do to get the air out? I'm actually asking, by the way. So what do you have to do? What are you doing to get the air out? Okay, so we've got sort of two conflicting answers here. So you're right that you're releasing your hold, what you're actually doing, at least at rest, okay, I'm going to assume that you're all resting and that you're not running on a treadmill while you're watching this, although you may be. Good for you if you are. That's pretty hard to coordinate. But really, the only thing you have to do to get the air out is to stop contracting your diaphragm. In other words, you have to relax. You have to stop doing things. Really, all you have to do is relax your diaphragm muscle. So there's a little bit of a mix of true and false in what you're saying. And I mean, pretty much for everybody here, which is this idea of pushing it out or blowing it out. You're not really blowing it out. I mean, the air is going out, but you're not forcing the air to escape. You're really just relaxing. And because the lungs are naturally elastic, they just blow the air out on their own. So for the most part, when you exhale, it's considered to be a passive process because really all you do is relax the diaphragm. When you relax the diaphragm, you're letting the diaphragm fall back into position here, and also the lungs are going to be doing a little bit of squeezing here. And that's going to cause a high pressure zone to form inside the lungs relative to the outside. And then that is going to be forcing air outside because there's a relative low pressure area outside. And air is always going to flow from high pressure to low pressure. So in general, relaxing the diaphragm leads you to exhale. Now, you guys are not completely wrong, by the way, about the pushing. Yes, there is a pushing aspect to this. For example, if you were exercising, okay, it's actually not sufficient to just relax and allow air to escape from your lungs. You actually can't ventilate fast enough by just relaxing. So you're not entirely wrong. By the way, I mean just at rest, and which is what I've kind of added up here at the bottom here. So you can speed that process up, and that is by contracting the muscles that are in between your ribs. So the muscles in between your ribs are called your intercostals, and when you flex those muscles in between your ribs, you can actually force additional pressure onto your lungs. You're creating a higher pressure inside your lungs, and you force the air out faster. So I have a feeling that that's what you guys are actually referring to by blowing out. You can blow air out of your lungs. You can make it exit the lungs faster. And so that's done by contracting your intercostal muscles. And when you're running, or if you're really ventilating a lot, you do have to add in a little bit of extra intercostal effort in order to push the air out, to cycle it a little bit faster through the lungs. But honestly, at rest, your intercostals are hardly ever being activated. It's mostly a completely passive process for exhalation. But I did want to add that caveat. I do have that mentioned. So it's sorry if I'm not. I mean, Callum, Brendan, Serena, you guys are not wrong that there's an additional component there. Or I guess Serena, you mentioned releasing your hold, which is sort of just like allowing you to relax your diaphragm. So that's probably the most true statement at rest. Does anybody have any questions about that, about how that works? There's one last thing I want to talk about regarding this, and then we are going to talk about some illnesses of the respiratory system. Okay. The last thing that I want to mention is what is actually compelling you I mean, other than your survival. But from an autonomic perspective, what's actually compelling you to breathe? If you hold your breath right now, you're going to get all kinds of neurological signals in your brain saying, breathe, breathe. You will crave air. You will want to breathe. And that's a nervous system response. And obviously, your body is detecting something is wrong. And it's maybe not as obvious as you would think. Your body physiologically has to detect something is wrong, something is incorrect, that is saying, we better breathe. We better breathe. Not only are they detecting the lack of breathing motion, which is actually not something that your brain is doing, it's detecting something else. Because when you first hold your breath, if you do a breath hold right now, I mean, for the first while, a significant period, maybe even 30 seconds, you don't really feel the urge to breathe. I mean, you can hold your breath for a while. You don't get into a panic about it. There isn't this urge to breathe. So at some point while you're holding your breath, something changes. Something changes, and all of a sudden your body says, I need to breathe. Something is wrong here. I think if you asked most people what that thing is, maybe I'll just ask you, what do you think it is? I mean, I wrote it here, so it's kind of unfair, but so maybe it's not a great question to ask. But your body does not detect the oxygen component. That's what you would think, right? You would think, well, there's less and less oxygen in the lungs, and as the oxygen gets lower and lower, it's going to make you want to breathe to get that oxygen. It's actually not the primary system that is involved in making you want to breathe. There is an oxygen component, and you can detect the amount of oxygen in your blood. However, the urge to breathe is actually coming from the buildup of CO2 in your blood. So when you dissolve CO2 in your blood, okay, when you mix carbon dioxide together with water, and actually you guys might know this, if you've ever had a soda pop before, which is carbonated water, does anybody know what the CO2 actually makes? I mean, I wrote it there, but maybe you don't know what that is. You've had it if you've ever had a carbonated drink before. Coke, Pepsi, even carbonated water. Do you know what it actually forms when you put it into water? CO2 in water? It makes something in the water. I'll give people a second if they want to take a guess. But maybe they don't. Oh, Calum's already got it. Carbonic acid. That's H2CO3. Maybe you remember that from grade 10, so you already knew this was carbonic acid. So carbon dioxide dissolved in water is an acid. It's carbonic acid. And your cells, you have certain groupings of cells in your body that are very, very sensitive to pH, which, if you'll remember from grade 10, that's the potency of hydrogen or the power of hydrogen. It's the amount of dissolved hydrogen ion in your blood, or how acidic your blood is. Okay, how much acid is in your blood. The more carbon dioxide you have in your blood, the more carbonic acid you have in your blood, which means that your pH of your blood is going to go down. Down, lower pH means more acid. Okay? Maybe you guys remember that from grade 10. People always mix that up, but a lower number for pH is more acidic. So the pH of your blood is going to go down. Okay? That's called respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is when there is a respiratory reason that your blood is acidic. Okay, respiratory acidosis. When the pH of your blood goes down, those cells go, whoa, high CO2, high CO2. How do we fix high CO2? And then the mechanism is increased breathing. If you increase breathing, you'll remove CO2, and then the pH of your blood is going to start going back up to normal again. And so this is a very good way for your body to monitor how much you're breathing. Really, are you breathing adequately? And it's all by measuring the pH of your blood. That's what's happening on a chemical level. And for the most part, this is the main system that is going to regulate how quickly you breathe. If you watch a lot of chubby emu videos, as I do, you may notice that in a medical context, often you will see, for example, patient comes in breathing rapidly. When people are breathing rapidly, their body is making them do that. And there are a few different reasons that someone might be breathing rapidly. It might be due to panic, but oftentimes when you breathe really rapidly, it's because the pH of your blood is too low, and your body is trying to compensate for that by increasing your breathing rate. Okay, and there's various reasons why your pH might be too low. It's caused by certain bacterial infections and all kinds of things. But this is a diagnostic criteria for physicians. If you're breathing too fast, it means your pH of your blood is too low. Now, conversely, if you're breathing too slowly, okay, you have a depressed breathing rate. Like maybe you're only breathing 6 times a minute. Okay, that's low. That might be there might be an issue with your pH of your blood being too high, because then the exact opposite happens, which is that your breathing rate gets depressed if your pH of your blood is too high. So this is all controlled by how acidic your blood is. That is the mechanism that controls how fast you breathe. When you exercise, remember that you're doing respiration in your muscles, right? They're doing a whole bunch of respiration. So when you look at the products of exercise, going back to Ricker's our formula for respiration from before, you'll notice that what you get in your blood is lots of this. Okay, not the energy component so much, that stays in your cells. The water component, you have no way to measure that. I mean, it's very, very small amounts of increased water anyway. But the one product that you get from exercising your muscles a whole bunch is a whole whack of CO2, okay? Which is going to cause the pH of your blood to go down, which is going to trigger you to breathe faster. That is what's making you breathe faster when you start exercising. It's actually forcing you to breathe faster. You don't have a choice. And so all of that signaling is based around CO2. I think that's fascinating. One kind of weird byproduct of that is that if you hyperventilate, which actually I shouldn't encourage you to do that, but if you do hyperventilate, breathe a whole lot, you may notice that you get a little bit lightheaded. Ooh. The reason that you get lightheaded is because you've removed a huge amount of CO2 from your blood, excess CO2. The pH of your blood has gone up because you're removing carbonic acid. And that actually, because the pH is changing up so much, it actually makes the neurons in your brain not function properly. You're actually adjusting the pH so much that it's causing neuron dysfunction, which is what is making you feel lightheaded, which is really interesting. If you do that, hold your breath after you've done your hyperventilation. What ends up happening is that the oxygen that's in your lungs is going to deplete over time, right? But the CO2, remember that you've hyperventilated, right? So you've like removed all of the CO2, or a very high proportion of the CO2 in your blood. And so it's going to take a while for that CO2 to come back up again. And there's a certain point where a certain concentration of CO2 where that's going to tell your body, oh, you need to breathe. This concentration is too high. But what ends up happening here is that the O2 is going to drop off faster than the CO2 is going to come up. And what ends up happening if you breath hold after hyperventilating is that when you get to here, to this spot, you don't have any oxygen, but the thing that tells you to breathe has not happened yet. And so you pass out. So doing a hyperventilation and then holding your breath is not a great idea. And when you're doing snorkeling, it's recommended that you don't do a lot of hyperventilation before you do your breath hold when you go snorkeling. Because what will happen is you'll end up swimming around, you'll run out of oxygen, but you haven't had that feeling telling you need to breathe yet, because your CO2 has not come up enough, and then you end up going unconscious underwater, which is a really bad place to go unconscious, by the way. There's plenty of snorkelers have died from doing that. So yeah, if you go unconscious underwater, it's a real bad day for you. So no hyperventilating. I think the maximum they tell you, if you like look at instructions and things, that they say no more than 3 breaths, but there are guidelines for that. You certainly don't want to do a ton of hyperventilating. Is this the same thing as breathing more quickly after holding your breath? Yes, it is. Your breath rate after holding your breath increases because you have increased the CO2 so high. What the heck? I don't know what's going on. You've increased the CO2 so high that you need to get rid of that excess CO2, and so you do additional fast breathing to bring your CO2 level back down to normal. So absolutely, it is related, Lily. Just excuse me for 1 second. Something funky is going on in my basement. Good thing I checked on that. My son has a little aeroponics thing in the basement where he's growing some plants, and it looks like the pump has run dry. He hasn't been putting water in it, and I'm glad I caught that. The pump would have probably caught fire. Anyway, let's keep going here. Let's talk about illnesses of the respiratory system. So I'm gonna go through a little slideshow. The slideshow is posted, so you can refer to the slideshow at any time if you want to go back and look at the slides. But what you're looking for each of these is the cause. So what has caused this illness to exist for a particular individual? What are the symptoms? So how does one experience it? And the treatments that are available. Okay, causes, symptoms, and treatments. That's what you're trying to pick out. Some of the slides are specifically organized into cause, symptom, and treatment, and some of them it's just more general information, and you pick out the cause, symptom, and treatment. Okay, so just as a heads up. All right, and it is found right. Oh, it's gonna make me log in again. Right here. What am I doing for time? Hopefully I'll be done this in the next 20 minutes. There are not a ton of questions and stuff to go along with today, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay, we already talked about this stuff. I did the anatomy. Okay, let's talk about some respiratory tract disorders. Emphysema. I mentioned this one before. Remember that your alveoli, those poor alveoli, are just 1 cell thick. And so you can chemically damage them quite easily. If you are repeatedly placing chemicals into the alveoli that are disrupting that very sensitive lining. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Ryan. I missed that you asked a question here. Is this why it's easier to hold your breath once the CO2 is breathed out? Yes. Yep. That's why it's more comfortable to do a breath hold after you've hyperventilated, because you've essentially removed most of the CO2 from your circulation, and so there's less of a feeling of air craving, because the CO2 is what causes that feeling of air craving. So you can hold your breath much better, much easier if you've hyperventilated first. It's just not a great idea. I mean, it's not going to probably harm you if you're like just sitting in a chair somewhere, although you could become unconscious, so you might hit your head. But if you do it underwater, it's certainly a terrible idea. Okay. Right. So if you are repeatedly exposing the inside of your alveoli to small particulate matter or certain chemicals, basically you're going to cause scarring to occur. Okay, so you end up getting cells that are like busted or whatever, and eventually it gets so scarred up that your body kind of just like seals off the alveoli. It basically becomes dead tissue. Or the alveoli, I mean, in the early stages, just become less elastic. And so obviously if you remove alveoli from being functional, you're going to have less gas exchange surface, right? And you need a large surface area to do the gas exchange. If you damage enough in a particular region, you can get a collapse of the bronchioles that go to that region because so much of it has been damaged or scarred over. Okay, and then that also can lead to things like air getting trapped inside in the lungs. So you get regions of the lungs where there's air trapped; it's not flowing in and out, which obviously can lead to infection if you're not cleaning out various areas of your lungs. It gives basically a perfect environment for bacteria to develop inside, and it's making it hard for you to breathe. I mean, that's the bottom line. You often people get barrel chested because first of all, it's difficult for them to inhale, and second of all, they get those trapped pockets of air in their lungs, and so they sort of have this like barrel chested upper torso. To an extent, Jaleel. So you can restore some of them if the damage is minor. It is possible to repair them, but remember that a lot of the damage that's coming to your alveoli is going to be repeated damage over and over and over and over again. If you're smoking, I mean, you're essentially damaging them every single time you smoke, times 50,000 or however many times you're smoking, lots of times, and you lose the capacity to repair them over time. I mean, it's like basically, that's like saying if you cut your skin, won't it heal? It will. But if you cut your skin over and over and over and over again, eventually you're going to start getting heavy scar tissue building up on your skin. And the same thing happens inside your alveoli. But the surface of your alveoli is much more important than the surface of your skin. Scarring on your skin is an inconvenience. Scarring on your alveoli means they no longer do their job. So it's pretty important not to scar them. And so what does that look like in someone? It often is a cough. So that's the smoker's cough that we were talking about earlier. It's often an indicator of emphysema. You get shortness of breath, trouble breathing out. That's because of the air that's getting caught in the pockets. You get weakness because you're not perfusing enough oxygen into your blood. The anxiety and confusion comes from low oxygen, basically, in your blood. If you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain cells, one of the side effects of that is anxiety and confusion. The heart failure comes from the damage that comes to your heart tissue from not giving it enough oxygen. And you eventually get starting liquid to build up, which is called edema in the lungs. And respiratory failure is when you just simply cannot get enough oxygen to maintain life any longer. That's respiratory failure. And so that is the eventual consequence of emphysema. Is that eventually you get respiratory failure, you can no longer perfuse your body with enough oxygen. So if you look at the cause, smoking is probably by far the most common cause of emphysema. Most cases of emphysema are caused by smoking. Depending on where you are in the world, it is more common in some areas due to pollution. I mentioned those small particles that make it deep into the lungs. That's PM 2.5. So there's 2.5 microns or smaller. That kind of stuff is pretty dangerous to be inhaling on a regular basis because it also damages the lining of your alveoli. And also infections can cause this. So you can get viral or bacterial infections, which can cause scarring in the lungs. Most of them are treatable, but not all. So what do? Well, you can give people more oxygen, so you can increase the percentage of oxygen that they breathe up to 100%. And that is going to increase the diffusion gradient across your alveoli that are still working. So it does perfuse your blood with more oxygen. However, there's only so much you can do. You can only give somebody 100% oxygen, and there is no way to fix the tissue once it's scarred over. It is a permanent issue. And so once you get to a point where you no longer can perfuse your body tissues, it's basically like a slow degradation until you die. So emphysema is scary. And it certainly is one of the major concerns with people that smoke. Don't start smoking. It's really hard to quit. And most of the stuff is not very pleasant. Certainly emphysema is very unpleasant. Here's an example of along on the left-hand side. This is sort of like a cartoon version of somebody that has emphysema. There's the little pockets that have sort of been sealed off from the rest of the lungs. So as I mentioned, Derek, it does heal. When you have minor damage to your alveoli, yes, they do heal. But the problem here is not that it's just single incident damage. Yes, your alveoli regenerate, and they do heal. But if you keep scarring them with particulate matter or certain chemicals, which are largely found in cigarette smoke, and other types of smoke, by the way, in some places in the developing world where you're inhaling cook smoke, like campfire smoke and stuff like that, you see the same types of emphysema in those individuals. So it's not specifically it's not specific to cigarette smoke. It's specific to smoke inhalation. This also, by the way, is applicable to people that smoke cannabis. You see the exact same type of degradation in their lungs. So there's not like there's no magic way that you can inhale smoke safely. That doesn't exist. But when you repeatedly damage the alveoli, Derek, eventually it loses its capacity to heal. I mean, you can only cut a piece of tissue or damage a piece of tissue so many times before it scars over permanently and then no longer heals properly. So for most smokers, I mean, they're exposing their lungs to this over and over and over again for many years. And yeah, it's permanent damage eventually. So if you're smoking for a short period of time, sometimes a lot of the alveolar tissue can recover. But the problem is that smoking is very difficult to quit. Most people don't really understand how hard it is to quit. And so most people don't smoke for a short amount of time. So that's something to consider. And everyone says that they will do that, but it's just not actually what happens in real life. So here's a real lung of somebody with emphysema, and doesn't look very pretty. But that's what the damage looks like. There's probably a high percentage chance this person died from emphysema. As a comparison, if you were to look at a person's lung, a non-emphysemic lung, first of all, the tissue is pink. It's supposed to be pink, not grayish brown. That's from the other chemicals that are in the cigarette smoke. But certainly you won't have these pockets of dead tissue. Similar, Lillian. It is similar with asbestosis. We're going to talk about asbestosis here as well. You can get emphysema with asbestosis, but it's slightly different mechanism, and it's more tumor-inducing for asbestosis. The way that the asbestos irritates the alveolar lining. We'll get to that one. I'm going to come back to asbestosis. Yes and no, Derek. Interesting comparison to vaping. Certainly, if you were to compare the two head to head, okay, cigarette smoking and vaping, the damage that cigarette smoking causes to your lungs is far and away worse. Okay, I mean, there's no contest here. You can't. They're not even comparable with regards to that. Cigarette smoking is much, much worse for your health than vaping is. I mean, that is. I don't think anybody is suggesting that they're the same. The problem with vaping is that we don't really know what the long-term health consequences are. And there are likely some. It doesn't directly cause scarring of the alveoli that we know of. And remember that vaping is very, very new. It's a very new phenomenon, so we don't have the long-term data in order to make that determination right now. But I mean, I think it's unlikely that it causes emphysema. But the problem is that when you're heating up a lot of these chemicals and vaporizing them, you are causing some of them to change chemically into potentially things that could be reactive oxygen species or free radicals, basically. It's free radical production that happens when you heat stuff up like that, especially the types of things that are heated up in vape, liquid, whatever you want to call it. So when you introduce things like free radicals and reactive oxygen species to tissue, it's usually not a good interaction. But we don't really have a ton of evidence of the specific effects. I would say if you're using vaping to quit smoking, that is an excellent idea. you should switch if you're trying to quit smoking. I can say that unequivocally. As a smoking cessation aid, it is far, 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 far less dangerous than smoking is. But I don't think that it's risk-free, and we really don't understand the long-term health consequences of vaping yet. There's some early research that suggests that there is some oxidative stress that happens to your alveolar lining with vaping, but we just don't know a lot about what the long-term health effects are. I certainly wouldn't go into it thinking that it has no consequence in terms of health. I think that that would be silly to assume that inhaling something like that in a really high concentration like you do when you're vaping is going to have no effect on the lining of your lung tissue. But it is certainly far, far less harmful than smoking. This is a smoker's lung. This is not a vapor's lung. This, I can guarantee you, is going to do some serious damage to your lungs. So I'm sorry. I hope I answered your question, Derek. I answered it to the best of my ability because there is not a huge body of data about vaping. But there is a little bit of preliminary data that suggests that it's probably not innocuous. In other words, it has no negative health side effects. But that being said, it's nowhere near as dangerous as smoking. So, okay, I'm going to keep going. Asthma. Asthma is when you impair breathing by essentially constricting or tightening up the bronchioles. One thing about the bronchioles, remember that those are the tiny little pathways that go from your trachea, from your bronchi, to your alveoli. They're the little tubes that go throughout your lungs. They actually have quite a bit of muscle in them. So if you look at this diagram right here, you can actually see that the inside of the bronchiole has a thick muscular layer around the inside. Well, not thick, but it has a muscular layer. For most people, that muscular layer is pretty much completely inactive. In other words, it doesn't do anything, and it doesn't constrict really under any circumstances. Why do we have a muscle layer around the bronchiole? I'm not entirely sure. I think it has something to do with redirecting blood flow, or it's an evolutionary leftover is what it is. It doesn't really serve any type of function for humans now to have a muscular layer on the inside of the bronchiole. So I don't know what it was historically for humans or for our ancestors, but I'm assuming it had some type of evolutionary function at some point for one of our ancestors. But it doesn't really have a function now. Now, the problem is, in some people, there are triggers that cause those muscles to constrict, and they get swollen. There is a, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm just going to say swelling for now. I can't think of the word. Swelling that occurs. And then there's also an increase in mucus production that comes during that, while that episode is occurring. And you can see that when that happens, that's really going to restrict your ability to pass air to your alveoli. And in fact, it does do that. So it highly, highly restricts your ability to breathe. Scary, really scary. So what does that look like? Causes coughing, and it causes very great difficulty breathing. Okay, and people can have this in a very profound way. So you can have profound asthma, and you can also have a very minor asthma where you don't get a lot of constriction during your asthma attack. What precipitates an asthma attack? It differs depending on the person. It could be inhalation of allergens like pollen or cats or environmental pollution, or there could be an infection in your lungs or in your bronchioles. Some people get asthma attacks from stress, which, wow, that's got to be tough. And so all of those things for people with asthma could potentially precipitate an asthma attack. Why does people's tissue do that in some people and not in others? We don't 100% understand the reason for that response. It's an immune response that's happening. There is some indication to show that people that are not exposed to allergens very much as a young person are more likely to encounter asthma as an older person. That is, if you live in a sterile environment as a child, it is possible for you to be more likely to have asthma. Maybe because your immune system doesn't understand what is and is not a deadly allergen. But that's not true for all individuals, and so we don't really 100% understand the reasons for precipitation of asthma. Now, if you are exposed to high levels of environmental pollution, or those things can actually trigger the onset of asthma in individuals, especially PM 2.5. We were talking about that. So if you're exposed to that a lot, it can potentially precipitate asthma in people. But anyway, the mechanisms are not that well understood in terms of why some people get asthma and some people don't. But what can we do? There's really two types of things that you can inhale in order to alleviate your asthma symptoms. One is you can take a bronchodilator. A bronchodilator is just a muscle relaxant that you breathe in. That's all it is. And so when you breathe it in, it causes the muscles around your alveoli to relax, and then they open up, making it easier for you to breathe. So that's the type of inhaler that you use during an asthma attack. There's also another type of inhaler, which is an immunosuppressor, which you don't take necessarily during an asthma attack, but you would maybe take regularly. And that actually inhibits the function of your immune system in those cells that are lining your bronchioles. And the idea being that they make them less easy to aggravate and cause an asthma attack. So that's more of a long-term treatment option. Those are steroids, usually, is what they are. I'm going to keep going here. Oh yeah, and these are just some things that can potentially precipitate asthma attacks in people. Mold, dust, pretty much anything that could be an allergen can potentially also trigger asthma attacks in people, because it isn't a type of immune response that you're having, although it can be triggered by stress. That's odd. Bronchitis. Whenever you see the word itis in biology or in medicine, and itis means inflammation. That was the word I was looking for when I said swelling. I was thinking about the word inflammation. That's what I was trying to come up with. It's an inflammation. So bronchitis is a very general term for having inflammation in your bronchi and in your bronchioles. So if you have inflammation in there, they are red and inflamed, that's bronchitis. So when people say, oh, I got bronchitis or whatever, that's probably true. You probably do have bronchitis, but I think people always assume that bronchitis is like a bacterial infection, or it could be. Sometimes bacterial infections cause inflammation of your bronchi or bronchioles, but it could be caused by a whole bunch of different factors. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an infection, but anything that inflames your bronchi or bronchioles is a bronchitis. That goes for anything with itis, by the way. If you've got dermatitis would be if you have an inflammation of your skin. Or if you've got pancreatitis, that means an inflammation of your pancreas. Or appendicitis is when you have an inflammation of your appendix. Any itis. Itis just means inflammation. So it's when you get inflammation. So what happens? Maybe you have an infection. Maybe you got irritated because you inhaled something that you shouldn't have inhaled. Any of those things can potentially cause bronchitis. You can get it basically from inhaling water by accident, or any of those things that cause lung tissue irritation could cause bronchitis. What does it look like? You get a cough. Usually there's sputum involved, which means like a cough with stuff in it. It may make it difficult for you to breathe. You might get shortness of breath. You might get wheezing. Bronchitis is one of the effects of COVID. People with COVID get bronchitis. So it causes inflammation. Now, if you smoke or you're exposed to environmental pollution, you're far more likely to be experiencing bronchitis, especially smokers. So smokers get bronchitis all the time. We talked about how they have a great difficulty removing irritants and stuff like that from their lungs. Plus, they're pumping their lungs full of irritants all the time. So that, by the way, is also true for vapors. So they are more likely to get bronchitis than people that don't vape. But then the question is always, is that causing long-term damage? Answer unknown on that one for vaping. But they are more likely to get bronchitis, irritation of their lungs, which just makes sense. You're inhaling a foreign substance into your lungs. Your lungs are meant for air. So when you put other stuff in them, yeah, it does cause irritation. And then this looks very similar to, if you look at a cross section of the bronchi or the bronchioles, you'll notice that this looks kind of similar to an asthma attack. But the difference here is that the muscular layer, which is on the outside, is actually not involved. So it's not being squeezed from the muscular layer. It's actually the layer right below the epithelial layer, the surface layer. That's where the inflammation is occurring. And that's what's causing the narrowing of the bronchioles. So this is a minor difference from an asthma attack. An asthma attack is when the muscle layer on the outside is squeezing it shut, and a bronchitis is when the decrease in diameter is coming from just irritation, basically, and inflammation. Pneumonia, often misspelt. Pneumonia is when your alveoli become inflamed. Okay, so it's similar sort of to bronchitis, except it's alveolar. Okay, so now we're talking about the end of the line. And when they get irritated or inflamed, they get filled with fluid. Liquid starts to come in. And lots of things can cause pneumonia. You can get it from bacterial infection, from a viral infection. There are fungal infections that cause pneumonia, parasites that cause pneumonia. You could get a chemical injury, so you could breathe in a chemical that potentially irritates your alveoli. You could get a physical injury to your lungs. So in other words, a stab wound or something like that could potentially cause damage to the alveoli, which could potentially lead to pneumonia. When you have pneumonia, you get cough, chest pain, fever, difficulty breathing. Pretty much anyone can get pneumonia, although the very young and the very old are the most susceptible to pneumonia. Pneumonia is another side effect of COVID, by the way. You can die from it if you have a very severe pneumonia. Obviously, if your alveoli are all filling up with liquid, you're not going to be able to breathe anymore. There won't be elastic, and you won't be able to pass gas across the membrane into your blood and out of your blood. If it's bacterial in origin, and that's fairly easy to figure out from a swab, then you got to treat it with antibiotics. And you know what? They'll probably give you antibiotics no matter what the cause is of your pneumonia, because you might get a secondary bacterial infection after you got the pneumonia from something else. So it's almost always treated with antibiotics, as far as I know, just to kill any potential bacteria you've got growing. And if it's viral, the antibiotics are not going to do anything. But hope for the best. So here's an example of some pneumonia on an X-ray. I mentioned that if you're doing a diagnostic technology, it'd be cool if you could find a example of a diagnostic that shows your illness. There's an X-ray of somebody with pneumonia. You can actually see the white. The white is just fluid that is developing inside of the lungs. Tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection. It's caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis. That's the name of the bacteria. If you've ever read like a novel from the turn of the century, like around 1900 or 1850s, you may have heard of people with consumption. People talk about people, oh, he got consumption and he wasted away. That's actually tuberculosis. They didn't know what it was back then. Well, I shouldn't say that. They in the early 1900s they knew what it was, but it was isolated in 1882. The physician that isolated it won a Nobel Prize, or the biologist, I should say. It's basically clumps of bacteria forming in your lungs, and obviously, if you have clumps of bacteria forming in there, it's going to affect your lung function. It's most common for it to affect the lungs, but you can actually get TB clumps, or tubercles they're called, forming anywhere. You can get neurological tuberculosis, where you get the tubercles forming in your brain. You can get tubercles forming in your abdomen. You can pretty much get them anywhere. Thankfully, we have excellent antibiotic treatments for tuberculosis, although more recently we're having quite a bit of trouble with antibiotic-resistant strains of tuberculosis. We talked about antibiotic resistance in the first unit. A little bit scary, but in general, we can treat this fairly well. What are the symptoms? You have a cough. Often it has blood in it, which is from the irritation that's caused by the tubercles. Fever. You get a lot of sweating, especially at night. And it causes weight loss. It causes decrease in appetite and weight loss. which is where the whole consumption name came from. People kind of look like they were wasting away when they got tuberculosis. Oh, we got a crying baby again. Anyway, usually can easily be treated with antibiotics, and most of those symptoms you only get after you have tuberculosis for a while. So hopefully it usually gets caught early, at least in North America it does. There's lots of places in the world where it's endemic, so it's around all the time. India would be an example. It's fairly common in India. Usually people get screened when they come back to make sure that they don't have TB. If you look back at the historical record, TB used to be hugely problematic. This is before the invention of antibiotics. But yes, it spreads very quickly. It can potentially be spread through spitting, but you just basically have to be in contact with somebody, speaking to them for an extended period, and then you can transmit it. So it's not that difficult to transmit TB. And it used to be very deadly, except we're much better at treating it now. So don't have to worry about it quite as much. Lung cancer. You guys know what cancer is. You would have talked about it in grade 10. It is a grouping of cells that are no longer being regulated in terms of their growth. So they have lost all of the genes that suppress tumors, that prevent uncontrolled growth, and those genes have been turned off due to damage. What's a great way to damage the genes of your lining of your lungs? Cigarette smoke. There are a number of carcinogens in cigarette smoke that are damaging to the genes, and if you keep damaging them, eventually you are going to damage the parts that suppress tumors, and you're going to cause lung cancer. It's pretty much inevitable. Not everybody that smokes gets lung cancer, but precancerous lesions are very common too, because you are going to disrupt the DNA of the lining of your lungs if you smoke. I mean, over the long term, it's inevitable. How much you disrupt it, I mean, it's a gamble. So my dad has been smoking his whole life. He has terrible emphysema. So he can't really climb a staircase, which is horrible. But he doesn't have lung cancer, so I guess there's that. But it's certainly, if he did get lung cancer, I wouldn't be surprised, which would be very unfortunate. But I mean, in this is the case, there's consequences to those actions, so it's one of those things. But lung cancer has an extremely high mortality rate. It's actually the second most common cancer for men and women. The first most common cancer for men is prostate cancer, and for women is breast cancer. But the second most common is lung. And it is by far the most deadly cancer for men and women. So if you look at prostate cancer, for example, I mentioned it's the most common. It makes up 30% of all cancer cases or something like that for men. If you look at the actual deaths from cancer, it is far overshadowed by lung cancer. And that's because prostate cancer is relatively easy to treat, but lung cancer is extremely difficult to treat. I mentioned earlier about how difficult it is to surgically remove pieces of the lung. You can do it. Every time you do it, you're removing a lot of lung capacity, so you obviously can't remove too much. You can't really do a lung transplant on somebody who has lung cancer, and mostly because it's almost certainly metastasized. Lung cancer has a terrible habit of metastasizing. That means it's gone to a different tissue in the body and started producing tumors there. So lung cancer has a habit of doing that. And so, I mean, it's basically pointless to replace the lung at that point. It causes a lot of inflammation and damage to the lung, which means that you're going to be always coughing and having difficulty breathing, serious chest pain. You repeatedly get bronchitis and pneumonia over and over again. It's a very painful way to die. So I don't wish that on anybody. And I know I've mentioned this several times, but I strongly encourage people not to smoke. About 50% of all cases of lung cancer are from smoking, and it's the most common cancer. So, it's the second most common cancer. And so that's a lot of overall cases of lung cancer. Lung cancer is quite common. Surprisingly, viruses and radon are responsible for the majority of the rest of cases of lung cancer. You might be surprised to know. Radon is a noble gas, which you probably are aware of, but it is radioactive, and it's very heavy. It's dense. It's a dense gas. And it has a tendency to accumulate in people's basements, especially if you live on the Canadian Shield, but you don't necessarily have to live on bedrock. But if you do, you definitely should be concerned about radon. But there are areas where radon just naturally comes up out of the soil, and it has a tendency to gather in people's basements. And if you breathe it in, it does cause lung cancer. So you can get this measured in your home. If you have granite countertops, granite has a tendency to leach radon gas into your house because due to the breakdown of some of the heavier elements in granite, it tends to form radon and then leach it into your house where it collects in the basement and you can potentially breathe it in. So these are things that you may want to investigate, especially if you have a lot of granite in your house. Some people do. You can buy radon detection kits at the hardware store and just find out if you've got some in your basement, but you should probably check since it's quite dangerous. Anyway, it causes maybe 30 or 40% of all lung cancer. It's actually just radon in people's basements. This is the kind of thing that, like, did anybody know that? It's not commonly discussed, but anyway, smoking is still the main cause, and you're 10 times more likely to get lung cancer if you smoke. So it's obviously a very strong contributor. Sometimes surgery is effective at removing it. Not a lot of lung cancers are operable, mostly because they've metastasized. But if they've transitioned to multiple places in the lungs, there's basically nothing you can do. So anyway, I don't want to talk about that one too much, but lung cancer is extremely difficult to treat. There's the slide discussing some of the options for removing masses in the lungs. Not a lot of great options. And you guys have already talked about this idea of proliferation of cells in a carcinoma or in a cancer. They grow, and then eventually they can make their way out of the tumor to a new location in the body. That's called metastasis. So some cancers are more prone to metastasis than others. Lung cancer is, and skin cancer, by the way, or at least melanoma, is also very prone to metastasizing, which makes it quite dangerous. Just to show you a little bit of a comparison between human lung tissue of a smoker and a non-smoker, that is what lung tissue is supposed to look like on the left. It's pink. You probably knew that already. And so healthy lung tissue is usually pink. The lung on the right-hand side is a smoker's lung. It is not pink because it has been repeatedly exposed to the chemicals found in cigarette smoke. And you can also see the lumps of abnormal tissue in it that are tumor tissue. That person on the right almost certainly died from lung cancer. So anyway, it's not pretty. You can probably guess how after repeatedly exposing your lungs to the chemicals in cigarette smoke over time, I mean, look at that lung, guys. I mean, eventually that's going to have some type of health consequence for you. There's no way you can get away with doing that your whole life and not have any health consequences. At the very least, it's going to cause emphysema. So anyway, we don't do this lab anymore. We used to go to U of G for a day and do a human dissection, or at least look at a human dissection. We actually stopped doing that a couple of years ago. I should take that slide out because Guelph doesn't offer it anymore. But it was a really cool field trip. A lot less people smoke now than they used to. That's a plus. It's probably gone down even from that. It says 18% in 2009. I would say it's probably closer to 15% now. So it continues to decrease, which is great. A lot of people are switching over to vaping, which again, if you were smoking and you switched to vaping, I would say that that's a very smart health choice on your part. If you're starting vaping from not smoking, I'm not 100% sure that that is a great health choice on your part, especially if you're vaping something that has nicotine in it, which is highly addictive, which may mean that you are presenting yourself with a lifetime of addiction, which may not be what you want to do when you're a teenager. So some things to think about. It might seem like you can stop anytime. Then I urge you to try if you can do that. I don't need to talk about the breakdown here socioeconomically, but certain people are more likely to smoke than others. There's a whole bunch of stuff in cigarette smoke. We don't need to go through the list. There's obviously carcinogens in there. I could probably find some better stats here. I mentioned the idea that it paralyzes your ciliated epithelium already, so that is Also one of the problematic issues with smoking. Oh, there's an electron micrograph of the cilia. There's a cool, I didn't realize I had it in this presentation. That's cool. That's on the left-hand side there. So those are the little hairs that grow on the ciliated epithelium of the lungs. Oh, I love that picture. That's a great picture. This is not in your note. I'm going to skip over this for time. Oh, what? Where's my slide on asbestos? Did I forget to include that? There, you guys have one on asbestos, right? Hold on. I'm sure there was one. An asbestos one. Isn't it the last one asbestos? Tuberculosis, pneumonia. Yeah, asbestos. There is one for asbestos. Okay, well, you know what? Oh, there's no one on lung cancer. Okay, you know what? These are totally connected to each other, because asbestos causes lung cancer. so fair enough. Basically, what happens is the asbestos molecule. It's a mineral. So if you look at it really closely here, I'm gonna draw this on my note, and then you can see what I'm talking about here. I might even fill in this part on the note for you, so you can see where this goes. So you've got asbestosis right there. So if you look really closely at asbestos, it's these sharp little, I don't know what to call them, not strips, but mineral crystals. Okay, if you've ever been, this thing's conking out on me. I hate that. If you've ever if you've ever been walking in the woods and you've had a burdock get stuck to your pants, yeah, I would just put the lung cancer stuff in the asbestos bubble. I'm going to add a little bit here. I'm going to discuss asbestos, but I would put the lung cancer stuff right here. Okay, so causes for lung cancer. I'm going to adjust this here. That's actually a great idea. I'm going to just make this one lung cancer. I forgot that I reorganized it like that. Sorry, guys. Lung cancer causes primarily smoking and radon is one of them, and virus infection. Symptoms: difficulty breathing. What else is in the presentation? Nope. Persistent cough, chest pain, bronchitis, and pneumonia. Treatment: surgery, radiation and chemotherapy, I'm just going to add in here at the bottom that it is not very effectively treated, unfortunately. Not a lot of good treatment outcomes with lung cancer, which is very unfortunate. Anyway, let's really quickly talk here about asbestosis. So I mentioned this idea that it's this like sharp crystal, which is very small, by the way. A tiny sharp crystal, very similar to a burr. So if you're like walking through the woods and you get a burr stuck to your pants or to your shirt, the reason it sticks is because it has like little hooks on it, right? That kind of like stick into the fabric of your pants. Well, asbestos is a lot like that, but for lung tissue. So when it gets really deep down into the alveoli, the crystals tend to dig in to the alveoli and get stuck. You don't really have any way to remove them. And so once they're in there, they continuously aggravate the tissue around them and cause inflammation. And when you get an inflammatory response over and over and over again, eventually you start getting scarring forming, abnormal cell growth. It triggers cells to grow abnormally. And eventually that abnormal cell growth can become cancerous. Okay, so it starts causing changes to the DNA of those cells, and then you end up building tumors. So asbestos there's really no safe level of exposure to asbestos. And once it gets in there, you basically can never get it out again. So luckily, we don't really use asbestos for anything, at least in North America anymore. There are places in the world where they still use it. We used to export it from Canada up until very recently, up until like 2 or 3 years ago, which is hideous in my opinion. I think that's terrible that we exported it because they do use it in some other countries, mostly in the developing world. We should know better, honestly. That stuff bothers me. But anyway, there are better alternatives to using asbestos, but it's fireproof. So I mean, and it's fairly good insulation. So we did use it for a long time. I mentioned on the website that I have a little video about the historical sort of uses of asbestos. This is actually an advertisement video of like, buy asbestos, use it for this and this and this. It's such a great material. So it used to be used extensively in North America, but we've really toned back our use of it. It's pretty much banned for any type of use as far as I'm aware. So anyway, if you're interested, you can take a look at that. So we have a little bit of time left over. I would recommend, if you're going to watch any of these videos, this is a really cool Chubby Emu video that talks about this person who decided to try and place laundry pods in their mouth. Don't do that. But there's also this awesome video that is a journey through the respiratory system, at least the upper part. So you can see the structures. I wouldn't watch the whole thing, probably cruise around and find the part where they're actually going inside. And you also have this fun asbestos video if you're interested. Now, you did come across a whole bunch of vocabulary from today too, I'm assuming. And so if you want to add that stuff to your vocabulary list from the unit, I would also strongly recommend it. There is no questions to go along with today's content. So in that regard, you don't really have that much to do. But I would consider, at the very least, watching this video because it's really cool. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I feel like I've been talking all day. If you have anything that you need to complete still, a missing assignment, there's obviously time for you to work on that as well. And if you want to drop by at 1 o'clock and you want to chat with me about, pretty much anything, but this stuff, drop by if you have any questions. Does anybody have any questions about the content right now? Before we do that? I'm going to post the updated version of this note as well. Oh boy, I got an angry baby upstairs. I don't see any. So if you do want to chat, come see me at 1 o'clock. And otherwise, we are going to pick up tomorrow with the circulatory system. We're going to get into our last of the 3 systems. Okay, guys, hopefully that was informative, and I'll see you tomorrow.